Inside the Ravenclaw common room, Dean Burton leaned back in one of the armchairs near the fireplace, the orange glow flickering across the blue and silver banners on the stone walls. The fire cracked gently. Outside, the grounds were cloaked in mist, and the moonlight hung in the haze like a suspended spell. The common room was mostly quiet now. A few students hunched over parchment, scribbling out last-minute essays. Someone yawned behind a teetering stack of textbooks. Dean twirled a quill between his fingers, Charm's homework forgotten in front of him. His mind wasn't in this castle. It was upstairs, in the trunk at the foot of his bed. Under a false bottom, wrapped in an old piece of cloth, was the broken time turner, the one he had taken from the ministry. He hadn't meant to steal it. Not exactly. It had started over the summer, during one of those long, boring weeks working at the Ministry of Magic. His dad, Marcus Burton, senior liaison for the Office of Magical Research Oversight, had pulled some strings and gotten him a summer job delivering packages between departments. The work was dull, endless corridors, stacks of enchanted paperwork, the same polite nods from witches in high-collared robes who barely looked up from their desks. One afternoon, Dean decided to cut a few corners and use the old maintenance lift, a shortcut, he'd heard, for people who didn't want to wait through every floor dinging past. What no one had mentioned was why no one used it anymore. The lift was temperamental. Sometimes it refused to move. Sometimes it rocketed all the way to the top and trapped people there for hours. Dean didn't think much of it, just shoved his trolley in, hit the button for the 5th floor, and leaned back against the railing. He was half asleep when the elevator shuddered and stopped. The doors opened with a groan. At first, he thought it was just another office corridor, dimly lit with frosted glass doors and ministry-issue carpet. But something was off. Dust blanketed the hallway, like snowfall. Candles in sconces flickered with a sluggish, bluish flame. The plaque on the wall near the lift read, "Floor 4.5." Underneath, in chipping gold lettering, the directory read, "Decommissioned wand storage, arcane containment overflow, temporal incidents, registry, unsorted prophetic archives." It felt like he'd stepped back in time, into a forgotten wing of history. Dean pushed his trolley forward, footsteps echoing in the stillness. Most of the office doors were sealed shut, their nameplates worn or missing. The further he walked, the more chaotic it became. Abandoned desks stacked with yellowed files, filing cabinets hanging open like broken jaws. Shelves had toppled. Glass crunched underfoot. Some kind of containment orb lay cracked on the floor, its misty contents long since evaporated. He paused in front of an old wooden door that had collapsed inward, half blocking the room beyond. He stepped over it. The office inside looked like it had been caught mid-explosion. Paperwork was strewn everywhere. A shattered hourglass sat on the edge of a desk, its sand glittering faintly in the dust. Glass cases lined the far wall, many smashed open from the inside. Long forgotten. Magical items, twisted brass instruments, bits of metal that hummed faintly, scraps of enchanted parchment, lay scattered in every corner. Something called him toward the desk drawer, which he tugged open with effort. Inside, buried under scrolls of parchment and tangled quills, was a wooden box. Dust covered the lid. Dean lifted it, and a cloud puffed out, making him cough. Inside the box, nestled in a velvet scarf the colour of deep midnight, was the time turner. It wasn't pristine. The chain was broken in 2 places, and the hourglass was slightly cracked. The golden casing was tarnished, one side bent, but it pulsed faintly with residual magic, like a heartbeat under glass. It looked abandoned, forgotten, like no one had touched it in years. It should have been destroyed. Every article, every announcement said the time turners were all obliterated during the battle in the Department of Mysteries. But this one had slipped through. Dean should have reported it, should have called someone, but instead he tucked it into the folds of the scarf closed the box, and stuffed it in the bottom of his bag. It had felt harmless then, like finding an old toy at the bottom of a drawer. But now, weeks later, sitting by the fire in the Ravenclaw common room, it didn't feel harmless at all. "You're miles away, mate," said a voice beside him. Dean blinked. Charlie Watts had dropped into the chair across from him, balancing a stack of sugar quills like he was auditioning for a circus act. "Long night? Or just contemplating the mysteries of the universe?" Dean smirked faintly. "Something like that." Charlie leaned forward, grinning. "Well, the kitchens are calling, and I'm not letting the first Friday of term go by without a proper midnight feast. You in?" Dean hesitated. He had essays to finish, a letter from his dad to reply to, and a broken magical artifact upstairs in his trunk. But none of that could quite outweigh Charlie's expectant expression, or the promise of pumpkin pasties and chocolate eclairs. He nodded. "All right, let's go." "Knew you'd come around." They slipped out of the common room, careful not to wake the snoring portraits. Their footsteps echoed as they passed the eagle door, then down the spiralling staircase into the colder, darker corridors below. In the kitchens, they were greeted with a warm burst of cinnamon and baked sugar. House elves bustled about, tying ribbons onto pudding dishes and charming trays to float toward the great hall. One of them, a round-faced elf in a butter-yellow apron, beamed when she spotted Charlie.
"Young Master Charlie," she squeaked, in her incredibly high-pitched voice, dropping her spoon and trotting over. "Back for more late-night mischief, is you?" "You know me, Pinny," Charlie grinned. "This is Dean, best mate. He's never had your peppermint toads before." Pinny's ears wiggled proudly. "Then we must fix that right away," she squeaked. Within minutes, she returned, balancing a silver platter stacked with pumpkin pasties, cauldron cakes, peppermint toads that hopped slightly on the napkin, fizzing whizbees, and a slice of treacle tart each. Dean could hardly carry it without laughing.
"She's got you trained." "She likes to feed people. I'm simply doing my part." They snuck back up the spiral staircase, muffling their laughter every time a peppermint toad leapt sideways, and made it to the Ravenclaw common room, without a single prefect spotting them. The fire was still glowing low, and they dropped onto the carpet in front of it, spreading out their loot. For a while it was just the sound of crackling logs and sugar-induced mumbling. Charlie leaned back on his elbows, licking tart crumbs from his fingers. "This is the stuff. I don't know how anyone studies this much and doesn't eat half a dozen cauldron cakes a week." Dean nodded absently, his fingers toying with a leftover wrapper. His thoughts flicked upstairs. The time turner. The way it shimmered faintly in the dark. The way it felt like something waiting. He opened his mouth. "Charlie, there's something I should—" But then Charlie yawned, long and exaggerated, flopping dramatically onto the rug. "If I fall asleep right here, just leave me for the prefects. Tell them I died doing what I loved." Dean laughed. The moment slipped away. "Nah, just don't snore and you'll be fine." The next morning, Dean woke up and immediately swung his legs off the bed, already thinking about the time turner. The Ravenclaw dormitory was still half asleep, soft morning light filtering through the tall, enchanted windows. The other boys mumbled and shifted in their beds, but Dean moved quietly, careful not to wake them. He dressed, grabbed his satchel, and made his way down to the great hall for breakfast. The castle was unusually quiet. A few early risers dotted the long tables, sipping pumpkin juice and flipping through textbooks. Dean took his usual spot near the end of the Ravenclaw table, filling a plate with toast, sausages, and a helping of eggs, but he barely tasted any of it. His mind kept drifting back to the cloth bundle hidden at the bottom of his trunk. As soon as his plate was cleared, he slipped away and headed back up the tower, taking the steps 2 at a time. In the quiet of the dormitory, Dean knelt beside his trunk and lifted the false bottom. The time-turner rested inside, wrapped in the same worn velvet he'd carried it home in from the ministry. He unwrapped it slowly, reverently, and set the gleaming device on his bed. The hourglass was thick, etched with strange curling runes along its frame. The magic inside it pulsed faintly, steady and warm, like a heartbeat. Dean turned it over in his hand, careful not to jostle the hourglass. He wasn't planning to use it. Not yet. He just wanted to study it, figure out the limits of its mechanics, maybe. Without thinking, his thumb brushed against the top ring. The hourglass turned. There was a strange tug at the centre of his chest, like being hooked behind the ribs and yanked forward. For one breathless second the world shimmered. The light around him bent sharply, his vision blurred, and then everything snapped back into place with a soft, golden crack. Dean stumbled backward, gasping. The dormitory looked the same, but something felt off. He turned in a slow circle, then froze. From downstairs he heard the faint echo of his own footsteps. From 2 minutes ago. Dean's hands trembled. He looked down at the time-turner in his palm. His stomach turned. He had gone back 2 minutes in time. His eyes widened in panic. He couldn't let his past self see him. That would be a disaster. Quickly he turned the hourglass again, the same tug, the same golden shimmer, and just like that, he was back. The dormitory was exactly as he'd left it. No echoing footsteps, no second versions of himself. Just silence. He carefully set the time-turner down and staggered away from the bed. The space behind his eyes pulsed with a dull ache, like his brain hadn't caught up with his body yet. It had worked. He sat down hard on the edge of Charlie's bed, trying to breathe through the panic. He couldn't keep doing this alone. Not if this was the kind of risk he was dealing with. Charlie would understand. Charlie always did. And more importantly, Charlie wouldn't let him get himself killed. Dean tucked the time-turner carefully back into its wrappings and replaced the false bottom of his trunk. He sat back on his heels, staring at the closed lid. It was one thing to find it. It was another to decide what to do with it. He didn't want to risk experimenting alone again. The strange lurch he'd felt when the spell worked, even for just a few seconds, had rattled him more than he cared to admit. Charlie would help. Dean knew that much without question. Charlie had the kind of steady confidence that made anything seem like a good idea at the time. And he was clever in ways Dean wasn't. Not just book smart, but quick, good at thinking sideways when plans fell apart. If Dean was serious about this, if he was going to push farther, he would need someone he trusted completely. The thought made him restless. He spent the day struggling to finish his charms essay and getting in a little studying for their defense quiz next week. He barely remembered lunch. He sat there playing around with the potatoes on his plate until he finally told his friends that he was heading to the library to study. His mind had become consumed with the time-turner and figuring out the best way to tell Charlie about it. After a few hours and lots of careful planning, he grabbed his bag and headed out of the library, hoping to catch Charlie before dinner. The castle was glowing with early evening light, the stained glass windows painting the stone floors with patches of red and gold. Students filtered down the staircases in noisy groups, their voices echoing cheerfully off the walls. Somewhere above him, Peeves shrieked with laughter as he chased a pair of terrified first years. Dean found Charlie near the entrance hall, arguing with a painting of a stern-looking wizard in dark green robes. "I'm telling you it's not vandalism if it washes off," Charlie said, waving an arm at the portrait, which was sputtering furiously. The great hall buzzed with the easy, cheerful noise of a Saturday evening. Candles floated low over the 4 long tables, their light glinting off golden plates and goblets. Platters of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and steaming vegetables filled the air with comforting smells. and the enchanted ceiling above shimmered with the first stars of twilight. Students lingered over dessert, chatting and laughing about Quidditch scores and Hogsmeade plans. Across the room, a group of Hufflepuffs burst into laughter as a bowl of peas levitated out of someone's reach thanks to a misfired spell. Dean picked at his second helping of treacle tart, only half listening to a debate about the best Quidditch team in Britain. The weekend buzz was contagious, but he was somewhere else, entirely. Charlie leaned over and dropped his voice. "So, when do we talk about your big secret?" Dean glanced around the hall. Everyone was distracted. Now was as safe a time as any. He nodded toward the doors. "Now!" Charlie grabbed a buttered roll for the road and followed him out. They made their way through the castle's quieter corridors and ducked behind a statue near Ravenclaw Tower, a witch balancing 7 books on her head. Dean checked the hallway, then spoke low. "I need to show you something, but you have to promise you won't tell anyone." Charlie gave a dramatic sigh. "Obviously." Dean unwrapped a cloth bundle from his robe pocket and revealed the cracked, twisted frame of a single time-turner. Even damaged, the magic inside it shimmered faintly. Charlie stared. "Blimey, you're serious." Dean nodded. "It still works." "A little. I tested it. Shifted just a few minutes. But it wasn't stable. Felt like Hogwarts lurched." Charlie blinked. "You do realize that's incredibly illegal, right?" "Yup." There was a beat of silence. "Okay," Charlie said. "So, what's the plan?" Dean sat back against the wall. "Basic containment charms. Patch the frame, maybe stabilize the sand's magical flow. I've read what I can, but we might need other books." Charlie's grin was immediate. "Restricted section?" Dean didn't deny it. They sat quietly for a moment, the weight of it all settling in. Then Charlie clapped his hands together. "All right, what's next?" "A test, small jump, few minutes, here, tomorrow night after curfew." Charlie nodded. "Better bring snacks. If we're going to accidentally erase ourselves from time, I'd like to be well fed." Dean laughed and rewrapped the time-turner with care. The two of them stood and slipped back toward the tower, their footsteps quiet against the stone. The castle was quiet, long past curfew. Only the wind against the windows and the occasional groan of shifting stone echoed through the halls. Dean and Charlie crept along the 7th-floor corridor under a disillusionment charm, the hem of Dean's robe snagging briefly on a rough tile as they paused in front of a familiar stretch of blank wall. Dean walked past it once, then again. The third time, a door appeared. Inside, the room of requirement had taken the shape of something between a workshop and a protective chamber. The lighting was low and warm. A work table near the wall was scattered with spell diagrams, a half-empty inkwell, and a cracked hourglass. In the centre, a faint circle of protective enchantments glowed on the stone floor, subtle but strong. Charlie exhaled. "Still can't believe this place does exactly what you need. Wish I could get it to spit out answers to OWL questions." Dean pulled the cloth bundle from his bag and unwrapped the time-turner, placing it gently inside the circle. "All right, 5 minutes. That's all we're aiming for. In and out. Nothing flashy." Charlie nodded but didn't look convinced. "You sure it's not going to explode? Or, I don't know, shatter our souls into the void?" "No," Dean said. "Well, I don't think so. I mean, there is always the danger of—" "Never mind, we'll be fine." Charlie grinned nervously and stepped beside him. Dean flicked his wand to activate the shielding charms. A shimmering dome blinked into place around them. Dean took a breath. "Here goes." He turned the time-turner. The world folded. It was like falling through fabric while standing still, time slamming sideways, light bending inward, the air thinning to nothing, and then snapping back with a pop. They landed hard, back in the same room. but it was off. The lighting hadn't changed, but the enchanted circle flickered like it was losing focus. The papers on the table rustled without wind. Charlie looked around. Did it work? Dean checked his watch. 7 minutes in the past, give or take. Before we got here, obviously. Outside the room, footsteps echoed. They froze. A slow, steady rhythm somewhere beyond the door. Charlie mouthed, "Filch?" Dean shook his head. No torchlight. The footsteps passed, fading. Silence returned. Dean gripped the time-turner again. "We're going back." He turned it. Another twist. This one sharper, almost biting. They stumbled as they landed, the room steadying itself around them. Dean's heart was pounding. He checked the clock spell floating above the desk, back in real time. But something had changed. The work table, papers that had been scattered, were now stacked. The hourglass was gone. Charlie noticed it too. "We didn't do that." "No," Dean said. "We didn't." The time-turner sat in his palm, glowing faintly, still warm. Charlie looked at him. "So, what now?" Dean didn't answer right away. He stared at the time-turner, the rippling glass of it reflecting flickers of the room. Then, "Now we get help." Charlie raised an eyebrow. "You trust someone else with this?" "No, but we need them anyway." Charlie nodded slowly. "Then we start figuring out who." They rewrapped the time-turner, doused the enchantments, and slipped out into the corridor, silent as shadows. The next morning, Dean and Charlie were among the last to leave the Ravenclaw Tower for breakfast. The castle was already awake with its usual energy, fluttering owls overhead, suits of armour grumbling to one another, and the faint sound of Flitwick's charm students rehearsing somewhere nearby. As they started down the winding staircase, Charlie glanced sideways. "All right, so what exactly is the plan?" Dean rubbed the back of his neck. "Not sure exactly. Guess we'll have to make it up as we go." He meant it half as a joke. But the truth was, he really didn't know. His chest tightened a little. He had taken on something serious, something dangerous, and all he had was a broken time-turner, a pile of half-decoded theory, and Charlie. The plan, as it turned out, was to be extremely careful, and even more secretive. For the next few days, Dean and Charlie met only at odd hours, early mornings before the rest of Ravenclaw was awake, or late at night when the castle had gone quiet. They didn't talk about the time-turner in public. They didn't leave notes sitting around carelessly. Everything stayed in Dean's notebook, written in codes only the two of them understood. Charlie wasn't as bookish as Dean, but he was clever, methodical, and surprisingly good at grounding Dean's wilder ideas. Where Dean saw the theory, Charlie saw the potential disaster. He made a rule early on: no jumps longer than a minute until we know it won't snap us in half. Dean had reluctantly agreed. He was eager to get the time-turners repaired and test their limits, to see just how far in time they could go. But Charlie had been the voice of reason, and put a cap on how long a jump could last. After all, they were just two kids with no idea what they were in for. To get the work done, they needed privacy, real privacy, and there was only one place in Hogwarts that could offer it. They decided the Room of Requirement was their best option. It had shown itself once before when they'd been desperate, but now they returned with intent, pacing with focus, whispering the thought aloud together. "We need a safe place to study and test the time-turners." The door appeared again, smoother this time, as if it had been waiting. When they stepped inside, the room had transformed. Gone was the dusty, cluttered chamber they'd stumbled into the first time. Now it stretched out wide, almost cavernous, with curved walls that shimmered faintly like old stone soaked in enchantment. Tall shelves lined the perimeter, holding stacks of books on time theory, ancient magical devices, and obscure ministry records they never would have found in the library. There were even spare components, gears, lenses, enchanted glass, neatly sorted in wooden drawers labelled in curling golden script. At the centre sat a massive work table, smooth and scarred with old wand burns. A row of floating lanterns bobbed above it, casting soft gold light that shifted with their movements. A large chalkboard lined one wall, already covered in diagrams they hadn't drawn, but recognised, runes for stabilising arcane flow, timelines split and braided, experimental loop anchors.
It was like the room had begun thinking with them. Charlie gave a low whistle. All right, now this is an upgrade.
Dean walked in slowly, his fingers trailing across the edge of the table. It's like it knows what we're building. Their work was slow, but they were making progress. Charlie helped reinforce the spells Dean had been using to stabilise the hourglass. They took turns logging every spell, every flicker, every pulse of light. Even the smallest shimmer in the sand felt like progress. By the third week, Charlie started calling them the Time Turner Society. At first it was a joke. He even made them a logo in the corner of the notebook, a wonky little hourglass with lightning bolts. But the name stuck. It made what they were doing feel bigger, real. And that's when things started to change. Dean became even more absorbed. He still kept up with his schoolwork, never missing a deadline or failing a quiz. But outside of class, it was like his focus had narrowed to a single point. During a friendly pickup game of Quidditch, he completely missed a clean shot, the quaffle bouncing off his broom while he stared off toward the castle. At dinner, he scooped mashed potatoes onto his plate, nodded through a conversation with Charlie, and didn't even notice when dessert appeared. Instead of lounging by the lake or joining in chess matches in the common room, Dean disappeared into the library, scribbling furiously into his notebook or buried in obscure magical theory texts.
One night, just as the fire in the Ravenclaw common room had burned low and most of the tower was quiet, Claire White approached them. She stood behind their sofa and spoke quietly but clearly. "You're not being nearly as secretive as you think you are." Dean and Charlie both turned, startled. Claire raised an eyebrow. "Whatever it is you two are sneaking off to do, it's obvious." Charlie looked at Dean, then back at Claire. "We're not—" "You're avoiding everyone, whispering to each other, disappearing at weird hours." She folded her arms. "I don't know what's going on, but if you're trying to keep it a secret, do better. People are going to start asking questions." Then, with a glance at both of them, she walked off toward the girls' dormitory. Charlie let out a low breath. Well, that was terrifying. Dean frowned, but he was thinking. Claire had noticed all of it, every slip, every pattern. He turned to Charlie. "She's sharp." Charlie gave him a look. "You're thinking of bringing her in, aren't you?" Dean didn't answer at first. She figured out something was going on without a single clue. That's exactly the kind of person we need. Charlie hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, but let's not hand her the blueprints just yet." They waited a few days. Then, one evening, Dean slipped Claire a note in the library. "Room of requirement, 9 o'clock. Come alone. D." She showed up right on time. When the door let her in, she stepped inside slowly, her eyes taking in the glowing sand, the diagrams, the enchanted hourglasses spread across the table. "You're working on a time turner." They both whipped around. Claire stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She began running her fingers over some of the runes that floated in front of the blackboard. Charlie straightened, his mouth opening and closing. "Claire, we—" She held up a hand. "Just give me a minute." Dean felt his stomach drop. How did you know? Claire stepped forward, her eyes scanning the work table. You've left out some notes. Diagrams, spare parts, she said, gesturing to the items around her. My parents are literally transfiguration and charms experts. I've seen hundreds of time-turner schematics growing up. I know what they look like. Charlie groaned and covered his face. Dean stared at her. You recognized it just from that. I recognized it because I'm not an idiot, she snapped, then sighed. You two are horrible at being secretive. The boys exchanged a glance, both at a complete loss. Claire walked over to the work table and picked up the notebook, flipping through the pages. So, the Time-Turner Society, huh? Charlie groaned again. Dean gave a weak smile. It was a working title. She looked up at them. Well, congratulations. You just got a new member. The room of requirement had adjusted again. Where once there had been only a few scattered chairs and a dusty table, the space now bloomed with quiet purpose. The enchanted ceiling flickered like candlelight against the high stone arches. One corner held a chalkboard and charmed diagrams that rotated slowly in the air. Another had gathered bookshelves, thick with old magical theory texts, repair manuals, and worn leather journals. Claire stood at one of the work tables with Dean and Charlie. All three bent over the barely functional time-turner. It was getting easier to speak freely in this space, like the room itself was muffling their voices from the rest of the castle. So it's a stabilization issue, Claire said, tapping her wand against the edge of the notebook. You've managed to repair the core housing, but the temporal anchor is still unstable. Charlie grinned. You got all that from one diagram? Yes, she replied, giving him a look. Because I'm literate. It comes down to reading and taking in the details. Dean laughed and leaned back in his chair. We haven't figured out how to test longer jumps yet. We're still keeping it under a few hours. Claire nodded. That's smart. But you'll hit a wall eventually. Temporal drift compounds exponentially the further you go. Charlie blinked. Was that English? She means we're going to need better magical reinforcement, Dean translated, and someone who can help stabilize the layers when they start to ripple. Claire hesitated, then set her quill down. Have either of you considered recruiting? The room went quiet. Dean frowned. You mean more people? Claire tilted her head. You're trying to fix one of the most complicated magical artifacts in wizarding history. Between the three of us, we've got maybe 10 good brain cells and a half-dead watch. Charlie made a wounded sound. I'll have you know at least 4 of those brain cells are mine. Claire rolled her eyes. We need someone who can handle magical structure, someone who can help you test jumps without blowing a hole through the castle. Dean looked uncertain. That's risky. More people means more chances we get caught. It also means more minds to help, Claire pointed out. And you're going to hit a wall eventually. You need someone who knows magic beyond just theory. Dean thought for a long moment, then said quietly, Who did you have in mind? Claire straightened. My cousin, Nora. Charlie raised his eyebrows. The Slytherin one? Claire nodded. She's intense, but she's brilliant. The Sorting Hat almost put her in Ravenclaw, but our family's been Slytherin for generations, and her older brother was already there, so she ended up in Green. She's not going to rat us out? Dean asked. No, Claire said. She'd never do anything to get me in trouble. The room was quiet for several seconds before Charlie said, I've got someone in mind, but you lot are going to think I'm insane. Charlie hesitated for just a beat after saying it, then added, Theo Blake. Dean raised an eyebrow. Theo? From Gryffindor. Claire tilted her head. Quiet, Theo? Yeah, Charlie said. He keeps to himself, but is sharp. Really sharp. I've seen the way he diagrams enchantments in class. He notices things even Flitwick glosses over. He's not loud about it, but it's there. Dean looked sceptical. You think he'd want in? Charlie shrugged. He's always got this look, like he's half listening to something no one else can hear. But I've talked to him a few times in study groups, and once you get past the quiet, he's thoughtful, smart, and weirdly curious. Claire tapped her fingers on the table. He doesn't strike me as the risk-taking type. That's the thing, Charlie said. I think he is. Just not in the usual Gryffindor way. He doesn't rush in with a wand raised. He goes digging until he finds something no one else noticed. I think if we show him the project, really show him, he'll get it. Dean considered this, then nodded slowly. All right, you talk to him. Nothing too revealing, just feel it out. Charlie grinned. Already planned to. He's in the library most evenings after dinner. I'll catch him there. Dean looked to Claire. You think Nora will actually show? Claire smirked. She'll show. She'll pretend she's skeptical, ask too many questions, and then solve 3 weeks of theory in her first 10 minutes. Dean leaned back in his chair and exhaled. Okay, 2 recruits. No promises. We ask them to meet. If they say yes, we bring them here and tell them the truth. Not everything, Claire warned. No, Dean agreed. Just enough to know what we're doing and what they're agreeing to. Charlie pushed off from the table. Then let's hope we're not making a huge mistake. The next evening, Claire spotted her cousin slipping out of the dungeons after dinner, heading for her usual study walk before curfew. She caught up just past the stone arch near the charms corridor. You're walking fast, Claire said, falling into step beside her. What's the rush? Nora didn't look over. I'm not rushing. I'm resetting. There's a difference. Everything okay? Claire asked. Yeah, Nora sighed. It's just ancient runes. We're still reviewing all our 5th-year translations. I feel like I'm glued to the textbook. Claire smirked. Then maybe it's time you joined something more interesting. Have a bit of fun. Nora gave her a sideways glance. You have that look. What look? The one you get before we do something we'll get letters home for. Claire just grinned. Come with me tomorrow night, after dinner. We're starting something. It's not school-sanctioned. It's not entirely safe, but it's fascinating. I think you'll like it. Nora slowed her pace, curiosity finally catching up. You're being vague. And what do you mean, not entirely safe? Claire, have you gone mad? Should I write your parents? She asked with a smile and slight giggle. It's just for now, Claire said. I need you to see it before we go into full details. Just say okay. A pause. If this turns out to be another secret cat club, Nora muttered, I'm hexing someone. Claire smiled. Noted. Charlie, meanwhile, took the quieter route. He spotted Theo in the library, right where he said he would be, tucked in a far alcove between the enchanted architecture shelf and the alchemical theory section. A stack of books leaned precariously next to him, and his parchment was a dense forest of notes, diagrams, and translations. Charlie approached slowly, not wanting to spook him. You always sit in the same spot. Theo didn't look up. Because it's the warmest one near the window. The charm on the glass leaks heat. Charlie pulled out the chair across from him and sat. You're not exactly great at avoiding detection, you know. I'm not hiding, Theo said, flipping a page. I'm avoiding unnecessary noise. There's a difference. Charlie smiled. Got a minute? Theo finally looked up. His expression was unreadable, but his quill stopped moving. 4. A project. Something you might be interested in. Magical theory meets practical experimentation. Theo blinked once. You're being vague.
It's not something I can explain here, Charlie said in a hushed whisper. I don't like riddles, Theo whispered back. Then come tomorrow night, Charlie said, after dinner, room of requirement. Theo studied him for a long time. This isn't for class, he asked. No. And it's not officially sanctioned? Not even slightly. Another pause. What kind of magic? Theo asked with his head tilted just slightly. Charlie hadn't seen him this interested in something ever. Charlie smiled. The kind they don't teach anymore. The next evening, the room of requirement was waiting for them. Dean had arrived early and was rechecking the calibration on the time turner. The core housing pulsed faintly under its protective charm, steady but still fragile. Claire stood nearby, flipping through her notes. She looked up when the door opened. Nora entered first, hands in her pockets, gaze sweeping the space with a calculating expression. Okay, not a secret study club. Points for that. Theo came in a few seconds later, quiet as always. He didn't say anything, just looked around once, then at the time turner, then at the rest of them. Dean cleared his throat. Thanks for coming. Nora crossed her arms. So what exactly are we doing? Charlie stepped forward. We're trying to restore something. Something old, something broken. But if we're right, it could change everything. Theo's eyes hadn't left the time turner. That's not a model. No, Dean said. It's real. And it's unstable. And we've been repairing it in secret for the last few months. Silence. Nora raised her eyebrows. You brought us here for illegal time magic. It's not about breaking rules, Claire said calmly. It's about understanding the boundaries of magic. And fixing something that was never meant to stay broken. Theo stepped closer to the device, voice low. You've tested it? Dean nodded. Short jumps. A few hours at most. Any anomalies? Some. But we've learned how to stabilize the smaller jumps. Nora looked from the time turner to Dean. And now you want to go further? We think it's possible, Charlie said, but not without help. That's why you're here. Theo was already scribbling something on a spare scrap of parchment, a list forming mid-thought. You'll need a fixed anchor. The magic won't hold without a stable reference point. Dean blinked. You know how to create one? Theo didn't answer. He was already halfway through a second line of notes. Nora gave a slow nod. If this thing breaks in the wrong direction, we're looking at castle-wide magical fallout. We know the risks, Claire said. Do you? Nora countered. Because I've seen what unstable magical architecture does to a containment field. It doesn't break clean. It unravels everything it touches. Charlie stepped in. That's why we need people who can keep it from unraveling. Nora considered that, then smirked. Fine. I'm in. But if I end up as a footnote in some ministry accident report, I'm haunting all of you. Theo looked up from his parchment. I'm in too. But I want full access to the device, and the notes, all of them. Dean exchanged a glance with Claire, then nodded. Deal. The room of requirement shifted around them, adjusting shelves and chalkboards and spare chairs. The flickering candlelight grew steadier. 5 students now stood in a circle around something that hadn't fully worked in over a decade. Charlie glanced around, then grinned. Well, welcome, officially.
To the Time Turner Society. Nora snorted. Is that the real name? Sounds like a club where we knit sweaters through history. Dean turned slightly red. It's a working title. Nothing official yet. Claire chuckled and scribbled something down in her notes. We'll sort the branding later. Dean, still flustered, cleared his throat. Name aside, I think we all know this can't be chaos. If we're going to work together, we need rules, structure, trust. Everyone nodded. They understood. This wasn't a prank or a club. This was dangerous, real. They agreed to reconvene Saturday night for their first official meeting. Saturday night came with a cold wind rattling the castle windows and the smell of damp stone rising from the corridors. Most of Hogwarts was tucked away in common rooms, studying or gossiping or playing endless games of exploding snap. But 5 students weren't. Dean, Charlie, Claire, Theo and Nora made their way quietly through the halls, cloaks wrapped targeting around them, footsteps muffled on the worn stone. Dean led the way, his mind racing. Claire moved silently at his side, scanning every corridor with a practiced eye. Charlie trailed behind, unusually quiet. At the 7th floor corridor, Dean paced 3 times past the empty stretch of wall, focusing hard. A place to plan in secret. A place to study and repair the time turner. A place to plan in secret. A place to study and repair the time turner. We need a place to plan in secret. A place to study and repair the time turner. The door appeared. Dean pulled it open. The room of requirement had changed again. Tonight, the space had reshaped itself into something warmer, smaller, like an old hidden study. Dark wood tables, towering bookshelves, a low fire flickering in a massive hearth. Soft floating candles lit the room in a low golden glow. It felt like stepping into a speakeasy dedicated to time turners. Dean exhaled slowly. Charlie let out a low whistle. Even Nora looked slightly impressed. They moved to a heavy oak table near the fire. 5 chairs were set around it, waiting. Dean pulled out the cracked time turner from his bag and set it carefully on a velvet cloth in the centre of the table, a reminder of why they were here. Claire sat down first, pulling a sheaf of parchment and a quill from her robes. We need to set rules, she said, without preamble. The others nodded in agreement. Dean began listing them out, speaking quickly but carefully. Rule 1. No one speaks of the society to anyone outside it. Rule 2. Decisions are made by unanimous vote. All members must agree. Rule 3. No using the time turners for personal gain. No cheating on exams, no altering Quidditch matches, no fixing love lives. Charlie grinned, not even trying to hide it. Sure, no personal gain. Cross my heart. No using it to pass transfiguration or ace herbology exams, or anything. Dean gave him a sharp look, but Charlie just shrugged innocently. They all knew the truth. Temptation would be part of the danger. It would be a harder rule to keep than it sounded. Rule 4. Every jump must be planned, witnessed and recorded. No solo experiments. Rule 5. All magical repairs, tests and experiments involving the time turners must happen only in the room of requirement. We never know who could be watching, and it's not worth the danger of someone witnessing a time jump because we got too comfortable. Dean leaned forward, tapping the table thoughtfully. We also need consequences, he said, if someone breaks the rules. Charlie grimaced. Expulsion from the society. Nora nodded. Immediate. No second chances. Charlie raised his hands. Fair enough. Harsh but fair. Dean scratched the rules into the parchment carefully. When they were finished, Claire pulled out her wand and charmed the parchment. A mild binding enchantment. Nothing painful, just enough to make sure their promises meant something. Each of them signed their name beneath the list, the ink flashing briefly silver as it sealed. For a moment, they just sat there, staring at the parchment. The fire crackled. The candles flickered softly overhead. They weren't just 5 kids sneaking around anymore. They were something else now, something real. Nora pinned the rules to a corkboard near the hearth and turned to them, serious but not unkind. "All right, Society. If we're going to bend time, we do it by the book. No shortcuts, no sloppy magic, no lies." Charlie gave a mock salute. "Aye, Captain." Nora rolled her eyes, but the corner of her mouth twitched. They stayed late into the night, drafting lists, discussing possibilities, arguing over magical strengths and weaknesses, until the fire burned low and their eyelids grew heavy. When they left to head back to their houses, they all felt a deep sense of excitement and purpose. What they were building would be bigger than any club or team Hogwarts had ever seen. With the society officially formed and all of its members sworn to secrecy, they wasted no time getting to work. Nearly every night they were either meeting in the room of requirement or having intense conversations in isolated areas of the castle. Each time they came up with a new theory or resolution to a new problem, they would meet up for a test jump. The society members all took turns jumping. They figured it was a better idea for there to be a rotation so that each member had a chance to experience what it was like. By early October, Hogwarts had settled into its familiar rhythm. The chill of autumn sharpened the mornings. Students wrapped themselves in scarves and heavier cloaks, and the grounds were dusted with fallen leaves in gold and copper. Inside, the halls buzzed with the low energy of mid-term essays and whispered weekend plans. In the room of requirement, however, things were far from normal. The society gathered again, the room shifting around them into its usual hidden study, the fire burning low and steady in the hearth. Dean laid the time-turner carefully on the main table, the parchment of rules tucked safely nearby. "One controlled jump," he said, glancing around at the others. 3 minutes. Nothing drastic. Claire, Theo, and Nora all nodded, their wands tucked into their sleeves just in case. Charlie gave a mock salute, but looked more serious than usual. Dean slipped the time-turner around his neck, the familiar weight settling against his chest. He felt the eyes of his friends on him, but kept his breathing steady. 1 jump, small and safe. He gripped the hourglass, turned it once, and the world lurched. For a heartbeat, everything doubled. The room twisted, the candles blurred, the shadows stretched long and thin across the walls. Then it snapped back. Dean stumbled but caught himself quickly. His pocket watch showed it. 3 minutes earlier, just as planned. He turned to the others with a grin starting to break across his face, until he saw Claire frowning, her eyes fixed on the floor near the table. "What is it?" Dean asked, his voice sharp. Claire stepped forward, pointing. There, just at the edge of the heavy oak legs, was a thin crack in the stone floor. Barely noticeable, no bigger than a hairline, but it hadn't been there before. Nora knelt beside it, running her fingers lightly over the stone. "It's fresh," she said quietly. "And look at the air," Theo added, tilting his head. Dean squinted. For a brief moment, a ripple moved through the space, like the shimmer of heat above a fire. Then it faded. Charlie shifted uneasily, hands stuffed deep into his pockets. "Could be nothing," he said, a little too quickly. Dean wanted to agree, wanted to brush it off, but deep down he knew better. The magic in the time-turners was broken. Each use didn't just bend time, it thinned something unseen, something fragile. He pulled the time-turner off carefully, wrapping it again in the velvet cloth. "No more jumps tonight," Dean said, his voice low. No one argued. They packed up quietly, the usual buzz of excitement missing. As they slipped back into the castle's dark corridors, the torches seemed to flicker strangely overhead, and the cold in the air felt sharper, biting deeper into their skin. At the stairwell, where the hall split, one way toward Ravenclaw and Gryffindor towers, another toward the dungeons, they paused briefly. No one said much, but the look they shared was clear. They couldn't afford another mistake. A small crack in the floor could mean nothing, or it could mean the beginning of a very serious problem. They needed to be more careful, think things out before rushing into jumps. Dean clapped Charlie lightly on the shoulder before heading off toward Ravenclaw Tower. "I'll meet you back in the common room, mate." Claire muttered something about late-night studying and headed after him. Theo peeled off toward Gryffindor Tower, saying he needed to give his herbology homework one final check. Charlie and Nora stood alone for a moment. It seemed as though everyone had rushed off in some coordinated move, but neither of them was upset about it.
"Well," Charlie sighed, glancing sideways at her, "I'm sure it's just coincidence we got left here together again." Nora raised an eyebrow. "Funny how that keeps happening." "You think it's fate?" he teased. "More like Claire," she smirked, crossing her arms. Charlie laughed softly. "You know, if we do end up breaking time, I'm glad I got stuck with you." Nora tilted her head, pretending to consider. "Dangerous charm, that line." "I'll risk it," he said. "Same time tomorrow." She nodded. "Try not to fall into any rips in the space-time continuum before then." He gave a little salute. "No promises." She smiled, and they parted ways, their footsteps echoing in opposite directions as the corridor settled into silence behind them. It started in the early morning as Dean made his usual walk from the Ravenclaw Tower to the Great Hall. He paused in front of the portrait near the third-floor corridor and blinked. Yesterday it had shown a wizarding duel in mid-blast, two cloaked figures frozen in a swirl of smoke. Today, the entire canvas had changed. The fat lady, the well-known gatekeeper of the Gryffindor common room, was seated in an overstuffed armchair in its place, sipping from a delicate teacup. Dean frowned. That wasn't her painting. She wasn't even supposed to be on this floor. As he passed a group of second years heading toward breakfast, he overheard one say, "I swear my Defense Against the Dark Arts class used to be on Wednesdays. Yesterday it showed up as Tuesday." Another chimed in, "Same. I thought I had potions in the afternoon, but when I got there, Slughorn looked at me like I'd lost my mind." Dean said nothing, but once inside the Great Hall, he pulled out his journal and scribbled a quick note beneath yesterday's log. Portrait shift, third floor. Students reporting swapped class schedules. Log number 12. The weather outside was acting up again, too. Claire had pointed it out at breakfast. One half of the sky outside the enchanted ceiling showed grey storm clouds and flickers of lightning, while the other half remained calm and sunny. A few students noticed. Professor Sprout mentioned a rogue experimental charm from the herbology greenhouses. Nobody seemed too alarmed, but Dean knew better. By midday he had gathered the others. The room of requirement offered them its usual quiet, with shelves of magical theory books, extra cushions, and the enchanted chalkboard glowing faintly in the corner. "This is the 12th entry," Dean said, tapping his open journal, "and that's only the ones I've caught." Claire leaned over his shoulder. Portraits shifting floors. Candles going out and back on in unison. The great staircase rerouting students back to the same corridor 3 times in a row. Theo scratched behind his ear, then pulled out a crumpled page. "Look at this. These are my notes from yesterday's history of magic, but they're different from what I remember writing. I'm sure Binns was talking about the Goblin rebellions, but this says something about time taxes from the 1800s. Nora shook her head. "That corridor near the clock tower. I watched a girl walk into it twice. Same girl, same steps.
I thought I was imagining it until she blinked like something hit her. Could be coincidence, Claire offered, though her tone wasn't confident. No, Dean said, it lines up. Every time we jump, even small ones, we're seeing more weirdness. Nothing big yet, but it's growing. Charlie, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. We should stop, at least for a little while. No jumps, no turner use, not even rewinds to check something. We let things settle, see if it fades. No one argued. Dean nodded. 1 week. We watch, we wait, we record everything. They all agreed, reluctantly. That afternoon, the great hall was buzzing. A fresh parchment scroll had been pinned to the enchanted notice board near the staff table, just below a fluttering banner reading, Hogsmeade Weekend, sign-ups open. Nora and Charlie found themselves hovering near it, pretending to examine the schedule, even though both had already written their names down. Zonko's is going to be wiped out, Charlie said. Last time, someone started a chain reaction sneeze charm and the whole alleyway had to be cleared. Nora grinned. Still sounds better than watching Theo pace in a time loop again. Charlie chuckled. Then, more softly, it was easier before all this. You know, before clocks started fighting back. Nora tilted her head. Regretting the secret society life? Not even a little. He glanced at her. If time rips in half, I want to be near you when it does. She rolled her eyes, but her smile lingered. Across the hall, Claire had seen the exchange and smirked to herself. By Friday, the castle was buzzing with weekend energy. Students were discussing Honeydukes flavours and planning who to meet at the Three Broomsticks. Dean packed light, just a scarf, gloves, and his journal. No time-turner, no plans. Claire met him at the gates. "Ready for a completely average, glitch-free weekend?" she asked. "I've never been so excited for boring," Dean replied. The village was lively. Snow had dusted the rooftops, and the smell of buttered treacle and roasted almonds floated in the air. Students flooded Zonko's and queued outside the shrieking shack for dares and rumours. At the Three Broomsticks, the group snagged a booth near the back. Madame Rosmerta, cheerful and bustling, brought their butterbeers before they'd even ordered. Theo blinked. "Wait, did we—" "She said we already paid," Charlie added, lifting a mug. Dean narrowed his eyes. "I definitely didn't give her money." They chalked it up to confusion, until a shopkeeper at Honeydukes insisted one of them had just bought a bag of fizzing sherbets 5 minutes earlier. "But I just got here," Claire said. "I haven't even—" "She said she saw you," Nora murmured. Theo looked unsettled but didn't say anything more. Dean stared into the foam of his mug, then quietly wrote under the table, "Glitches spreading outside Hogwarts. No jump interference. Passive anomalies increasing." That night, back in the Ravenclaw common room, Dean couldn't sleep. The castle was quiet, too quiet. The magical torches burned low. Owls hooted faintly beyond the tower windows. Dean sat at the desk by the corner window and unwrapped the velvet cloth. The time-turner rested inside, still, untouched, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. He opened his journal to a clean page and wrote, "We've pushed too far." Then he turned the page. There, drawn in his own hand, was a symbol. He didn't remember drawing it, but the ink was fresh, and the shape. It was identical to the jagged crack that had first appeared beneath their feet during the last full jump. Dean closed the journal slowly. The situation was getting worse. After what seemed like weeks of little blips in reality, the worst of it seemed to be over. For the first time in a while,
Students moved through the halls of Hogwarts with a kind of settled rhythm. There were still whispers now and then about a staircase that led to the wrong floor, or portraits that had briefly swapped places, but nothing too serious. It was enough for most people to simply move on. Hogwarts was notorious for weird occurrences, so it seemed most people were comfortable accepting that was the case this time. Even the professors seemed to brush it off as typical castle magical errors. Flitwick even told a story about how he was stuck on a moving staircase that had decided to stop mid-air when he was a first year. "A whole day's worth of classes stuck on those steps," he said in his high-pitched, squeaky voice. Dean noticed it the moment he stepped into the great hall that morning. The sky above the enchanted ceiling was a soft, dappled grey. Toast and eggs appeared neatly on golden plates, and conversation hummed around him at a normal volume. A group of fifth years at the Hufflepuff table were joking about a ghost who'd shown up during Charms class and asked for directions to the dungeons. No panic, no chaos, just Hogwarts being weird, in the usual way. Dean glanced down the Ravenclaw table. Claire had just arrived and gave him a quick nod, sliding into a seat beside her friend Abigail, and Charlie spotted Theo at the Gryffindor table, halfway through a plate of sausage and eggs. From a distance, he could see Nora in a light-hearted conversation with her fellow Slytherins. Things felt normal again. That evening, the room of requirement greeted them with the familiar creak of wood and the soft flicker of enchanted lanterns. The magical space had changed slightly since their last meeting. Now it resembled a tucked-away study, with high shelves packed with magical theory books, a gently bubbling kettle in the corner, and a few well-worn armchairs pulled into a circle. It seemed to be suggesting that the society spend more time researching and less time testing for the moment. They all sank into the seats, grateful for the quiet. Theo opened the meeting. "Still no major anomalies on the map," he said, spreading out a parchment filled with tracking lines and rune marks. "Last week the corridors were practically humming. This week, nothing." Nora nodded. "I checked the North Tower myself. No echoes, no doubling. Even Peeves hasn't been acting out." Claire added, "The astronomy tower candles held steady last night. No flickers, not even during the full moon." Charlie leaned back. "So, that's it then? We're in the clear?" Dean hesitated. "Maybe. Or maybe time just healed a bit, like a wound closing up." "We still need answers," Claire said firmly. "Even if the glitches have stopped, we never figured out what caused them exactly. We don't know how much damage we did, or how to reverse it." Dean reached into his bag and pulled out the box they blocked the time-turner in. The device remained nestled inside, unmoving. It almost looked harmless again. "Then we keep researching," he said. "We don't test it, we don't touch it, but we figure it out." They all nodded in agreement. Charlie stood. "All right then. Back to the books." The next few days passed in a blur of library hours, scribbled notes, and magical theory sessions. Dean and Charlie spent an entire evening copying diagrams from a dusty arithmetic index. Nora found a passage about time scars, remnants of fractured magic that could persist long after the original spell had faded. Claire translated half a footnote in ancient runes that suggested time anomalies could sometimes be smoothed out by strong ambient magical fields, like those around Hogwarts. They weren't sure what any of it meant yet, but it gave them direction. Outside their study bubble, life at Hogwarts rolled forward. By the end of the week, the castle buzzed with anticipation for Halloween. Potions that morning had been uncharacteristically cheerful. Professor Slughorn, dressed in a velvety orange cloak with tiny animated skeletons dancing around the hem, had declared it a day for delightful mischief. Instead of brewing anything that smelled like swamp rot or threatened to explode if stirred wrong, they were tasked with creating giggle drafts, a harmless potion that caused uncontrollable laughter for exactly 60 seconds.
"This one's for joy, not grades," Slughorn had boomed. "Let's see who can make the most effective blend." "And no poisoning your classmates, eh?" he said jovially.
The classroom quickly filled with the sounds of sputtered laughter, hiccuping spells gone wrong, and the occasional bang of a cauldron lid flying off. Charlie's potion had worked a little too well. He spent a full 2 minutes doubled over in silent wheezing fits before finally collapsing to the floor, still shaking with giggles. Dean, who had managed a decently brewed draught himself, glanced around and caught Claire smirking behind her cauldron, eyes glinting mischievously over her goggles. "It's nice," she whispered, as Theo's batch erupted in a fountain of purple foam, "to have a day where everything doesn't feel like it's about to fall apart." For once, Dean agreed. Hogwarts felt right. By evening, the entire castle had transformed. Pumpkins with twisting, shifting faces floated above the halls, their carved mouths glowing with flickering orange light. The staircases were dusted in cobwebs spun by charmed, non-biting spiders, and the portraits had all dressed for the occasion. Witches in feathered hats and vampires in powdered wigs, all waving or sneering at students passing by. Ghosts glided through the corridors in more coordinated fashion than usual. Nearly headless Nick wore a tattered Tudor ruff dipped in spectral blood, and the bloody Baron trailed ectoplasmic chains that clinked faintly over the stone floor. Even the suits of armour chimed in. As students passed, some raised their swords in salute or played eerie tunes with their visors clanking in rhythm. The great hall transformed. Hundreds of carved pumpkins floated above the tables, their faces shifting from grins to scowls to winks as students passed underneath. Swarms of enchanted bats swooped gently through the rafters, leaving trails of glitter in their wake. The ceiling above showed a stormy night sky, lit by flashes of distant lightning and the glow of a full moon. Candles hovered low over the tables, flickering in rhythm to the eerie music drifting from a self-playing harp. The food was overwhelming. Mountains of pumpkin pasties, cauldron cakes oozing chocolate, piles of treacle fudge, and golden plates stacked high with roast chicken and spiced potatoes. Jugs of butterbeer steamed beside crystal pitchers of spiced apple cider. Some students had arrived in costumes, not mandated, but encouraged. A Hufflepuff girl wore a wide-eyed papier-mâché mandrake mask and groaned dramatically every time someone got near. 2 Gryffindor boys had bewitched their robes to resemble flaming phoenix wings, and a Slytherin trio had charmed floating jack-o'-lanterns to hover ominously above their heads. Staff allowed the use of magic to be a little more liberal when it came to festivities like this. Tricks and charms that would usually land a student in detention received jovial laughter and praise tonight. Charlie had eaten 3 pumpkin tarts before anyone could stop him. "I'm testing the stability of seasonal magic," he declared, mouth full. Dean rolled his eyes. "You're going to test the stability of your digestive tract." Claire swatted a floating sugar quill away from her head and leaned over to Dean. "This might be a great night to get a meeting in." Extended curfew and people running about the castle celebrating. We wouldn't be missed at all. Dean didn't disagree. The room of requirement was quiet. The time-turner was locked away. For once, no one was whispering about time glitches or shadows that didn't line up. As the feast continued and laughter echoed through the great hall, the society slowly drifted from the celebration. Not because they weren't enjoying it, but because part of them couldn't sit still. Not yet. They slipped away one by one until the group had quietly gathered in the familiar corridor.
The room of requirement door appeared. Tonight, a skeleton dancing with a smiling jack-o'-lantern was etched into the wood. Inside, they expected stone walls, book piles, maybe even a flickering lantern. What they found was entirely different. The room had changed. It looked like a miniature Halloween carnival. Floating jack-o'-lanterns lined the walls. A table of charmed snacks danced in rhythm to invisible music, tiny pastries that spun like tops, licorice bats flapping their wings, and butterbeer that poured itself into mugs as they approached. Cobweb streamers shimmered between hovering candles, and a little banner had unfurled above the fireplace. "Take a night off. You've earned it." They stood there for a moment, stunned. Charlie let out a breathy laugh. "Okay, that's creepy." "But," Fair Theo poked a floating donut, "I don't think we're getting any research done tonight." Dean stepped forward and picked up a mug, watching as the foam danced at the rim. "No," he said, smiling faintly. "Not tonight." And just like that, the room welcomed them in. They played magical games. Theo and Charlie got into a heated competition over a charmed pumpkin ring toss, and someone conjured a floating music box that filled the air with an old, slow, wizarding waltz. Claire danced with Nora. Dean sat cross-legged on the carpet, laughing until his sides hurt. No planning, no strategy, no timeline to fix. Just friends in a room that knew exactly what they needed. Later, after the Society's little party, Dean sat alone in the Ravenclaw common room. The tower was quiet except for the soft tick of the magical globe spinning lazily above the fireplace. A few stars flickered in its surface, casting faint reflections on the walls. He opened his journal and flipped through the most recent entries. Pages filled with diagrams, notes, sketches of strange echoes and ghostly footprints. Pages that felt like they belonged to another lifetime. Tonight, there was nothing new to report. Dean picked up his quill. No anomalies this week. No rips. No echoes. He stared at the sentence for a moment, then closed the journal slowly. The situation was getting better. The room of requirement had returned to its usual rhythm, quiet, watchful, and brimming with shifting magic. The time-turner sat on a velvet cloth at the center of their work table, surrounded by books stacked 4 or 5 deep and scrolls rolled open at both ends. Bits of broken timepieces and gears were scattered nearby, carefully organized into labeled jars by Nora, who insisted on maintaining some semblance of order even as the group sank further into theoretical chaos. The Society had resumed meeting regularly. At first it was slow, just a few hours here or there between classes, but over the past week they had fallen back into their old momentum. Nora and Abigail focused on cross-referencing magical repair theory. Dean and Charlie traced magical blueprints and old schematics. Theo spent his hours poring over ancient references no one else had the patience to interpret. One night in the library, long after most of the candles had burned low and Madame Pince had given them her final warning glare, Theo sat hunched over a particularly brittle book with fading gold ink. "Got something," he whispered sharply. Dean looked up from a stack of enchanted object manuals. "Real something? Or you think it's something? Theo jabbed his finger at the page. "Listen to this. In the spring of 1994, Headmaster Albus Dumbledore approved limited academic use of a ministry-issued time-turner for 1 student under strict supervision. Authorized only for intra-campus time rotation." Charlie blinked. "That's Hogwarts." "That's here." "And that wasn't too long ago," Theo added, eyes gleaming, "which means someone figured out how to make it work safely inside the castle. They must have had to adjust for magical interference, maybe even some type of architectural distortion." "This is it," Dean said, standing up. "This could be exactly what we need." The group clustered in around the book like it might vanish if they didn't absorb the words fast enough. They debated theories, scribbled questions, and made plans to trace school records and former ministry permissions. There was a sense of quiet triumph in the room. And then... The next morning, it all screeched to a halt. A Hufflepuff boy named Max came storming over. "Don't shoot the messenger," said Max, plopping down beside the others. "But Professor Thatch is already putting together exam review packets." Charlie groaned. "Exams? It's not even December." "Well, technically it's end of November," said Claire, juggling a handful of scrolls and one rogue chocolate frog. "And you have ignored every announcement about term projects for 3 weeks straight." Max nodded. "And Binns just floated through my divination class to remind us we still owe him 20 inches on goblin uprisings. Nobody even has history with him on Tuesdays." "I think he does that just to haunt people," Nora muttered, already flipping through her arithmancy notes. "Anyway, we all knew it was coming. The professors are starting to lock in grades before winter break, and just like that, the Time Turner Society hit pause. The castle settled into the oddly quiet tension that came with exam prep. The hallways seemed more focused. Students tucked into corners reading aloud to themselves or scribbling down notes with frantic urgency. The library was packed. Even the usually boisterous Hufflepuff basement quieted down to a low study murmur. Charlie, for once, attempted to behave. "If I can just make it through one potions practical without melting a table, I'll call that a win." Theo raised a brow. "You accidentally summoned a fire imp during last year's exam." "That was different," Charlie shrugged. "That was on purpose." Dean sat cross-legged on the floor of the room of requirement, surrounded by textbooks. The time turner remained untouched beside him, nestled in a cloth-covered box. For now, their efforts were on hold. He watched as Theo traced timelines into the margins of his astronomy book without realizing it, and Nora muttered formulas under her breath like a spell. They were still a team, just not one meddling with time this week. By the weekend, their meetings had mostly dissolved into quick check-ins between classes or late-night nods in the hallway. For the first time in months, they looked like regular students, even if they weren't. The castle had shifted. Gone were the glittering pumpkin garlands and floating bats of Halloween. In their place were colour-coded study charts, enchanted hourglasses counting down to exam days, and the tense hush of students memorizing wand movements between bites of toast. December had settled in with heavy skies and the kind of chill that clung to your robes even near the fireplaces. The Time Turner Society had come to an agreement, unspoken but firm. For now, they would press pause. Not because they were falling behind, quite the opposite. All 5 were known for their academic drive, even Charlie, who somehow coasted through exams with half the effort and double the charm. But Hogwarts demanded attention this time of year, and even time travelers had to prioritize grades. Instead of late-night leaps through magical corridors, they buried themselves in scrolls and textbooks, scattered across the library and their respective common rooms. Dean claimed his usual spot at the far end of the Society's favourite table in the library, cross-legged on the cushioned bench, a roll of parchment hovering mid-air as he drew runes with a flick of his wand. The ink glowed faintly blue as it dried. Theo preferred to pace. He moved between bookcases in steady circuits, muttering defensive theory under his breath as enchanted flashcards floated ahead of him like hovering quiz spirits. Claire, curled up near one of the tall arched windows, had developed a colour-coded revision system for arithmancy. Her notes shifted hue as she worked, blue for correct, red for recheck, gold for mastered. Charlie, as usual, had his own unique approach to studying. He balanced a copy of 1,000 magical herbs and fungi on his head, while reciting potions ingredients in reverse. He claimed it improved his posture and memory, though it mostly just made Theo anxious. The room of requirement sat unused for a few weeks, its door quiet and undisturbed on the 7th floor. The group had sealed their notebooks, literally. Theo placed a timed locking charm on their records, set to open only after the final exam. It had felt like a respectful goodbye for now, not an abandonment. "We'll come back to it with sharper minds," he said, as the last shimmer of blue light faded into the worn leather cover.
Dean nodded, and probably fewer stress spots. Charlie leaned dramatically against the wall. "You'll miss my chaos." "Don't deny it." Claire rolled her eyes but smiled. "We'll survive." By Monday morning, exams had officially begun. Slughorn greeted them with a grin too cheerful for what came next, a cauldron set up, a table of mystery ingredients, and no recipe. They were to brew the potion based solely on sensory deduction. "I believe you've all been blessed with all of your senses. Now it's time to put them to the test. Figure out what the potion is, then brew up a masterpiece," he said in his deep, jovial voice. Theo tapped into full work mode, quickly identifying the telltale shimmer of a wit-sharpening potion and adjusting his measurements accordingly. Claire hesitated, torn between two possibilities. Charlie added what he thought was powdered bicorn horn and ended up summoning green smoke that let out a loud, wet belch. Slughorn found it delightful. "Inventive, Mr. Harper. Not correct, but inventive. Definitely worth a few extra points," he said, giving Charlie an approving pat on the shoulder. In charms, they were given a series of objects and told to demonstrate control, creativity, and precision. Claire elegantly floated 5 items at once, orchestrating them into a spinning pattern. Theo went minimalist: levitate, rotate, set down. Dean tried for finesse and succeeded, until the final object slipped and wobbled like a dizzy top. Charlie attempted to enchant his exam parchment to dance. It did, right off the desk and into the examiner's teacup. He got partial credit for flair. Their herbology exam came the next day. The greenhouses were freezing, their glass panes coated in condensation. The students were tasked with identifying rare magical herbs and correctly harvesting them. Dean lost his gloves within the first 5 minutes. His fingers glowed faintly pink by the end, thanks to a dittany mishap. Theo lent him a salve afterward, and Nora offered to transfigure his hands into mittens until the sensation returned. That afternoon, in their transfiguration exam, they were tasked with turning a quill into a living creature of their choice. Nora managed a sleek owl in miniature. Charlie's became something between a bat and a spatula. Dean's fluttered into an origami butterfly, shimmering with ink. For the first time all term, Professor Hestia's lips twitched into something resembling a smile. The exam the group dreaded the most was the final test, held first thing in the morning, which was the worst possible time for history of magic. Professor Binns, as always, floated into the classroom and began the exam by assigning 6 long-form essays in complete monotone. Charlie sighed, then got to work, doodling magical creatures in the margins. His essays were sharp, though, dotted with snarky asides about goblin rebellions. He still somehow earned top marks. The others weren't able to coast as easily as Charlie. Dean felt like his eyelids were made of lead and struggled to stay awake, let alone write a decent paper. And a Slytherin boy named Felix dozed off mid-exam, knocking a bottle of ink over onto Nora's shoes and bag. She was forced to waste precious test minutes cleaning herself and her belongings up. Through it all, the society members managed to pass their History of Magic exam with top scores.
just a reflection of the incredibly gifted group they were. A week after the last exam, with things finally settling down around the castle, Theo lingered in the library long after the others had packed up. He'd wandered deep into the restricted section, under the guise of writing an advanced potions paper on poisons, following a hunch through stacks of old ministry inspection records and magical education audits. There, buried in the brittle parchment of an oversight report dated just under 20 years ago, was a single line that stopped him cold. Headmaster Albus Dumbledore granted special permission for a student to use a ministry-issued time-turner to attend multiple classes at the same time, during a single school term. Theo blinked. He reread it twice, then scribbled down the citation in careful handwriting and shut the book with reverence. The next night, back in the room of requirement, they gathered again, relaxed, recharged, and buzzing with the quiet excitement of a new lead. Theo slid the parchment onto the table. "This," he said, "is our next step." Claire leaned in. "This could be it." Dean nodded. "Let's find out who that student was." Charlie cracked his knuckles. "Time to dust off the old notebook." The room of requirement shimmered around them, its walls reconfiguring, welcoming them home. The pause was over. The Time-Turner Society was back in motion. The last week of term brought a different kind of energy to Hogwarts. Snow blanketed the grounds in thick, sparkling layers. Icicles hung from every tower and windowsill, some enchanted to chime gently when the wind hit them just right. Inside the castle, garlands of holly and mistletoe curled around banisters, and the scent of warm treacle pudding drifted through the halls. Students shuffled to class wrapped in scarves and heavy robes, their cheeks red from the cold. Lessons lightened. In charms, Professor Flitwick had students enchant ornaments to float in mid-air, grading them on height, spin, and sparkle. Transfiguration became a contest to see who could turn pine cones into the most convincing singing gnomes. Even Professor Binns cracked a joke, though no one was quite sure if it was intentional. And then came the Hogsmeade trip. It was the final Saturday before the break, and the whole village seemed to glow. The rooftops were blanketed in snow, shop windows shimmered with enchanted frost designs, and carolers from the local magical choir floated slightly above the ground as they sang near Honeydukes. Every lantern flickered with warmth, and even Zonko's was playing festive music out its front door. Charlie, of course, made a scene. He and Nora had wandered ahead of the others and ended up in the centre of the town square, where a little crowd had gathered to listen to the floating choir. Without warning, Charlie stepped up beside them and bellowed out, "On the first day of Christmas my true love gave to me a phoenix feather for my wand tree." Heads turned. A few people laughed. Charlie grinned wider. "On the second day of Christmas my true love gave to me 2 house elves cleaning and a phoenix feather for my wand tree." By now students had stocked to watch. Nora's face was flushed, half from the cold, half from embarrassment, but she couldn't stop laughing. "On the third day of Christmas my true love gave to me 3 broomsticks zooming, 2 house elves cleaning, and a phoenix feather for my wand tree." Theo appeared just in time to mutter, "I don't know him," before joining the applause anyway. The final days flew by. Students rushed to exchange gifts, owl deliveries came in by the hour, and the castle grew quieter with each departing student. By the end of the week, only a handful remained. That evening, as the snow piled high on the windowsills, and the last feast wrapped up in the great hall, the society slipped away down a quiet corridor. The room of requirement greeted them like an old friend. It had reshaped itself again, a cosy, warm common room filled with low fires, deep armchairs, and heavy red curtains that blocked out the winter chill. A small tree stood in the corner, sparkling quietly with blue and silver lights. They didn't work that night. No planning, no spellcraft, no experiments. Instead, they lounged in armchairs, sipping hot chocolate conjured by Nora, swapping stories about the worst presents they'd ever received, the best snowball fights, the strangest family traditions. Charlie insisted that his uncle once enchanted all the Christmas crackers to explode in showers of frogs instead of prizes. Theo tried to one-up him with a story about magical snowstorms in his grandmother's sitting room. Dean barely talked at all. He just sat back, letting the voices wash over him, feeling, for the first time in weeks, that the society wasn't just a secret. It was a family. A messy, stubborn, slightly mad family. The Hogwarts Express rumbled steadily over the frozen moors, its windows fogged with condensation and the low golden glow of lanterns inside. Dean leaned against the window, watching snow blur past in soft white streaks. Charlie sat across from him, legs kicked up on the seat, lazily levitating a chocolate frog card in circles with his wand. Theo was fully engrossed in a heated conversation with another Gryffindor named Alexander, over which teams they predicted to make the Quidditch Cup next year. It was a welcomed break from all the days of feasting, snowball fights and laughter echoing through drafty stone corridors. Nora and Claire were sitting in the next compartment with some girls from Charms Club, excitedly chatting about spending the holiday in Spain with their families. By the time the train pulled into King's Cross, London was draped in wet grey skies and slushy sidewalks. Dean's mother was waiting with a thick coat and a tighter-than-usual hug. His father, busy with work again, had sent along a letter tucked in a ministry envelope, wishing Dean a peaceful and productive break. Dean knew what that meant. A quiet house, a lot of time to think, and maybe an opportunity. The days leading up to Christmas were a blur of home cooking, half-finished holiday decorations, and evening fires crackling in the grate. Dean didn't mind the quiet. It gave him space to work through ideas that randomly popped in his head whenever he thought about the time-turner. His father's study was off-limits, technically. A sharp-cornered room packed with magical regulation binders, artifact monitoring logs, and thick legal volumes Dean wasn't supposed to touch. But 2 days before Christmas, after his parents left early for last-minute shopping in Diagon Alley, Dean thought he might take a quick look to see if he could find anything that could help with getting the time-turner fixed and working. Dean waited half an hour after they apparated away. Then he slipped the lock with a practiced whisper and stepped inside. The study smelled like old parchment and the faint burn of flue ash. Dean moved quickly, pulling open filing cabinets and rifling through drawers until he reached the older storage, thin folders wrapped in ministry red ribbons, some dusted with silver-stamped, archived labels. He knew what he was looking for: any oversight files from magical artifact permits between 1989 and 1994. He flipped past wand registration logs, confiscated spell journals, cursed item containment logs. Then he froze. One folder was labelled Time Artifact Authorization, Restricted Use / Research-Based Contracts. His heart thudded. He pulled it free. Inside were a dozen yellowing sheets, contracts signed, revoked, or expired. Some bore stamped insignias from the Department of Mysteries. Dean skimmed until one in particular made his breath catch. It was a 1-year usage license for a time-turner issued to an individual for use in school. The name was redacted, but the initial field was clear: HJG. Dean nearly dropped the page. He grabbed a quill and quickly scribbled the line into his notebook, copying the date and department code just in case. Then he pulled out a spare bit of parchment and scratched a hasty message. Found something. Contract. Time-turner. Initials HJG. Dated within our range. Will explain more. Dean. He folded the note carefully, and once he'd closed the study back up and dusted his footprints from the carpet, sent it off with the family owl. He searched the study once more, turning every drawer upside down, but the rest of the contracts were either blacked out or incomplete. Nothing else usable. Still, his fingers buzzed with the find. HJG. Christmas morning arrived cold and quiet. Dean's family home wasn't loud like Hogwarts, but it was warm, stockings on the mantel, cinnamon toast for breakfast, and a woolen jumper hand-knitted by his grandmother waiting by the fireplace. Dean unwrapped presents slowly, grateful but distracted. From Charlie came a roll of enchanted parchment that sang a different Hogwarts jingle every time you unrolled it. Charlie had written on the back, "For emergency morale boosts. Use wisely, or not wisely. Up to you." Theo's gift arrived in a box with no note, a sleek, smooth stone ring etched with tiny runes, a focus charm, subtle and powerful. Among the final presents in the pile, one stood out, not because of what it was, but because of where it had come from. Wrapped in sun-bleached paper and sealed with enchanted snowflakes, the package from Nora and Claire gave off a faint scent of sea air and lemon. Inside was a two-part gift, a small enchanted globe that, when tapped, projected a floating seaside sunset above your head, and a note written in Nora's looping hand with Claire's scrawl squeezed into the margins. "Merry Christmas from Costa del Sol. We miss the room of requirement already. Thought you could use some sunlight during the break. Don't go poking time too hard without us. Love, N+C." Dean smiled, holding the globe up as golden waves rolled softly over his ceiling. The warmth of it filled more than just the room. It filled the quiet space between them all, stretching across distance and time. He smiled, held the note close, and leaned back on his pillow. He didn't know exactly who HJG was, but when he got back to Hogwarts, the Society was going to find out. The platform was half shoveled, half frozen, and loud with voices when the Hogwarts Express pulled into Hogsmeade Station. Students began pouring out as Hagrid called for order and directed students to the wagons that were waiting to transport students up the hill to the castle. Dean hoisted his trunk onto the snowy ground and scanned the platform. He spotted Claire and Nora immediately, bundled in thick coats with matching scarves from Spain, waving at him with gloved hands. Charlie wasn't far behind, dragging his trunk like it weighed 100 pounds, grumbling the whole way. "Dean!" Claire grinned, cheeks red from the cold as he joined them near the first waiting wagon. "Happy New Year!" "Hey," he said, shouldering his bag and brushing snow from his collar. "How was the trip?" "Incredible," Nora said, hopping a little to keep warm. "Our grandparents took us to this little wizarding village in the mountains. No muggles for miles. Even the fireworks were spelled to bloom into constellations. And Claire got hexed by a souvenir necklace," Nora added cheerfully. "It was a charm trap," Claire huffed, "and I barely got hexed." The doors to the wagon creaked open, and the group climbed inside. Theo slipped in behind them just as it was shutting. He gave Dean a nod, settling into the opposite bench without fanfare. Charlie gave him a once-over. "Enjoy your holiday solitude, mate." Theo snorted. "Loved every minute." Everyone laughed, but for a brief moment Dean could swear that he saw a sadness in Theo's eyes, like he wasn't exactly telling the truth about how it was being at home for break. However, the moment quickly passed, and Charlie and Theo jumped back into their debate on their ranking of chocolate frog cards they were having before break. The wagon lurched into motion, the enchanted windows frosting over as the castle drew closer. They sat quietly for a moment,
the hush of snow muffling the wheels beneath them. The wagon creaked and swayed as it climbed the snowy path toward the castle. Nora leaned forward slightly. "Did you ever find anything else in your dad's study after the initials?"
Dean shook his head. "Nothing useful. Just the contract with HJG. I searched until they got back from shopping, but that was the only thing that seemed connected." Claire nodded slowly. "Still, that's a solid lead. It proves someone had permission to use a time-turner during that exact window." Dean glanced between them. "Yeah, it's something. I figured we could try digging through the school's records, see if we can match the initials to a student or staff member." Charlie raised an eyebrow. "Records?" "Yeah," Dean said. "The library keeps student logs, assignment archives, course schedules, even disciplinary slips. If someone got ministry permission, there's a good chance the school documented something too." Nora smirked. "So we're going on an archive hunt?" Dean gave a half grin. "Looks like it." The castle loomed larger ahead, glowing warm against the grey sky. Whatever quiet moments they'd had over the break were already behind them. The rest of the ride was filled with lighter chatter. Charlie rambled about nearly blowing up a gingerbread cauldron during a baking contest with his siblings. Nora confessed she'd tried skiing after they returned from Spain and had immediately crashed into a snowbank, dragging Claire down with her. Theo stayed mostly quiet, watching the falling snow beyond the wagons, a half-smile tugging at his mouth now and then. At last, the wagon came to a creaking stop before the castle steps. Smoke curled from the high chimneys, and the sky had already turned to a velvet blue. As they climbed out and stepped into the snowy path, Dean felt it, that low, warm hum in the stones of the castle. They were back. The following weekend, they decided to spend their Saturday meeting in the library instead of watching the Quidditch game between Slytherin and Hufflepuff like the rest of the school. The wind clawed at the windows of the library as the society huddled in the far corner, cloaked by both shadows and a well-placed disillusionment charm. The restricted section loomed behind them, locked away under Madame Pince's usual enchantments. But today Theo had found a workaround, an old back room where misfiled ledgers and uncatalogued scrolls collected dust. "This one's from '92, Charlie whispered, flipping open a logbook of class timetables. "You think they'd still list students by name?" "They listed everything," Dean said, already hunched over a stack of brittle pages. "Even how many quills a student checked out, if you dig deep enough." Nora lit the edge of her wand with a faint blue glow, careful to shield it beneath a folder as she scanned a column of names. "Nothing under HJG here, just house rosters and exam schedules." "Try the course ledgers," Claire said, already spreading out parchment. "I found a folder labelled Schedule Conflicts. Might show us something weird." It was Theo who made the first sound of interest, half gasp, half scoff. "Guys, look at this." They crowded in. Theo tapped a single name on a master timetable. This girl was registered for arithmancy and divination. Same block, same day. Claire frowned. Maybe an error. Nora flipped to the next day's page. "She's in Ancient Runes and Care of Magical Creatures, again. Same time slot." Charlie whistled. "Okay, that's not a fluke." They kept flipping. Transfiguration, Muggle studies, potions, always stacked, always impossible. "Maybe she didn't actually attend all of them," Claire said, but her voice held doubt. "She did," Dean said quietly. "Look at these attendance rolls. She never missed a day, in either class. That's just not possible without some sort of magical assistance. Or—" He trailed off, frowning, clearly turning something over in his head but not quite ready to say it. "Or a twin," Charlie exclaimed. Nora rolled her eyes and shot back playfully, Charlie, if she had a twin, her sister would have her own name and schedule. Charlie sat in thoughtful silence for a beat, then suddenly hopped up and declared, "Or a clone!" He threw his hands up before anyone could cut him off. "I know there's no such thing as an actual clone, but it could be something like polyjuice potion. Remember that myth about those kids years ago who brewed polyjuice in a girl's bathroom? Maybe whoever HJG is, they managed to pull that off." Claire gave him an amused look. Charlie, who would have been the other person living her second life? It's a good theory, but HJG using a time-turner is a lot more likely. Once the discussion of clones and twins died down, Claire called everyone's attention back to the form. She reached forward slowly and turned the page to confirm it again. "This has to be them. Hermione Jean Granger," she read aloud. HJG. "The brightest witch of her age," Theo murmured. Dean sat back. "So she's the one." The time-turner was issued to her, probably to help her take more classes than allowed. Charlie leaned back on his elbows. "That explains the authorization. She was using it on campus and the ministry signed off on it." "And if we can get a good look at it," Claire started, "then we can figure out what's missing from ours," Dean finished. For a long moment they stared at the pages in front of them, the cracked, faded evidence of something once extraordinary, something lost to time. They regrouped the next night in the room of requirement. This time it shaped itself into a planning room, wide chalkboards with shifting maps, clock faces that tracked magical pulses, glowing diagrams of their damaged time-turner hovering mid-air. Claire paced in front of one as Dean traced their old jump paths with string and pins. "If she had it during third year," Dean said, "we have to pick a day where she makes a jump. One where the class times overlap enough to give us a window." Charlie snapped his fingers. "We bump into her right before she jumps." Theo nodded. "In the crowd. Maybe on the staircases. Quick sleight of hand." "Then we follow her to her second class," Claire added. "Observe how the time-turner holds up, how it responds to spell pressure, temporal anchoring, everything. Then return it before she even realizes it's gone." Dean didn't look up. "We can't damage it. Not even a scratch. If we mess with her loop, it could collapse the whole thing. She'll never have made it to that class." Nora frowned. "And if she doesn't make it to that class, the ministry notices." "She gets caught. No more time-turner. We can't risk that." "We won't," Claire said firmly. "We're not changing her loop. Just riding the edge of it, watching, learning." Discovering who HJG was changed everything and set the society on a whole new path. The group now knew that she had used a time-turner, a fully functioning, ministry-issued time-turner, one that hadn't shattered or spiraled out of control. "She never told anyone," Nora whispered, almost in awe. "She couldn't have," Claire said. "It must have been confidential." "Probably part of the terms." "It means she carried it on her during the day," Theo added, "not just tucked in a desk drawer. She would have had it on her person, between classes." They sat in silence, letting that settle. "We need to see it," Dean finally said. "See it how?" Nora asked. "It's not like we can walk up and ask her about it. This was years ago." "We go back," Dean said. "Just far enough. One of us follows her. Maybe we even—" He hesitated. "Maybe we borrow it. Briefly. Just to observe. Just to study." Charlie gave a low whistle. "You're talking about jumping all the way to her third year." "Not yet," Dean said. "Not until we're sure we can do it safely.
And so began the trials.
They didn't try to leap years right away. That would have been reckless. Instead, they extended outward bit by bit. The week after Hermione's name surfaced, Theo jumped 3 months back and observed a herbology lesson from the greenhouse rafters. He returned without incident, except for a small cut on his sleeve he swore wasn't there when he left. Dean followed, jumping 6 months back to a summer afternoon. He said it felt normal at first. Except, he added, I'm almost positive the shadows moved too fast. Like time was running a little ahead of itself. Claire went next, leaping nearly a year. She lingered just outside the courtyard for 5 minutes and returned with a pounding headache and a strange sense of déjà vu. She didn't tell the others, but when she looked out the castle window, she saw the clouds were moving in 2 directions at once. One Tuesday, as Nora passed the tall brass clock in the west corridor, it flicked forward to 1:59 p.m. as she approached. But as she passed under it, it ticked backward to 1 o'clock and began to chime the hour. She didn't even pay attention to it. In potions, students were deep in a complicated bubbling project with multiple stages and timing steps. It felt like a blur. Half the class emerged blinking and confused, convinced they had run out of time far too quickly. In truth, the castle had lost 20 minutes. Time had simply slipped out from under them. Back in the common room, Claire's watch and the dormitory wall clock disagreed by 11 minutes. Charlie tapped both of them, reset them, and forgot about it by breakfast. Meanwhile, the plan for Hermione took shape slowly. At first, they imagined observing her from afar, but they quickly realized it wouldn't be enough. We have to see the mechanism, Theo said, how it reacts, how she uses it. It's the only way we'll learn. But she never uses it in public, Nora reminded them. That's the whole point. She kept it hidden. Then we time it, Dean said. Figure out when she's in class, distracted, and borrow it? Charlie raised an eyebrow. And so, with nerves tucked behind forced confidence, they began to map the timeline of her 3rd year. Not through observation, that would come later. For now they relied on reconstructed schedules, passing periods, and what little they could glean from old class rosters and student records. Claire pulled archived timetables from the library's restricted stacks. Theo cross-referenced floor maps with course locations, while Dean charted the possible walking routes between each room. They studied how long it would take a student to cross from arithmancy to ancient runes if the classes were back-to-back. They factored in the busiest stairwells, known corridor shortcuts, and which routes were likely to be flooded with chatter and chaos between bells. Nora tracked which days were most tightly packed with transitions. Charlie highlighted 2 intersections where traffic was almost always at its worst. They wouldn't know exactly where Hermione would be, but they could make an educated guess. They would need a perfect moment. But first, they had to prove they could even reach it. They continued testing, anchoring, pacing their jumps, and all around them, time was beginning to tilt, just slightly. A candle would burn too fast. An echo would arrive a second too late. A hallway that always took 30 steps would sometimes take 28. The society noticed none of it, because they were focused on one thing, Hermione Granger and the time-turner she carried. The room of requirement stretched into a long, open study chamber again, lined with parchment scrolls and glowing diagrams. At the far end, a hovering illusion rotated slowly, a hallway schematic of the 2nd floor east wing. Small notations flickered around it. Professor pacing, student movement, scheduled transitions. Dean leaned back from the table and rubbed his face. Okay, so we know she has it. Definitely, Claire said. There's no other way someone shows up in McGonagall's class and arithmancy 3 corridors away, 5 minutes apart, for a full semester. And it's her? Nora asked, gesturing at the file in Claire's hand. Claire turned the parchment to show Hermione's school ID photo. Top marks in everything. Multiple commendations. Says she took on an unusual course load 3rd year and received special permission. Everything points to her. Theo gave a short exhale. Hermione Granger. Charlie tilted his head. She looks intense. Probably because she's doing the work of 2 people and pretending it's fine, Nora muttered. She'll be in the corridor just before 1:10, Claire said. That's when she leaves Ancient Runes. She cuts through the East Wing to get to her next class, Magical Creatures. And we're sure it's this corridor? Dean asked. Charlie nodded. This is the only route that intercepted that cleanly with both rooms, and the timestamps from the logs line up within a margin of seconds. Nora stepped forward. Then it's settled. We intercept. 1 accidental collision at the corridor bend. If she's wearing the time turner, we take it. Just for a moment. Copy the enchantment, make a few sketches of the gear and clock alignments, if we can, then get out. Claire looked uneasy, but said nothing.
They all looked to the cracked time turner hovering in the centre of the room. The glass inside was cloudy now, the sand sluggish and unstable. This could be our only shot, Dean said. If we understand how hers functions, we might be able to finish fixing ours. Charlie grinned, but there was a nervous energy beneath it. Borrowing a time turner from Hermione Granger. No pressure. Just for a few minutes, Dean muttered. The room fell quiet as final preparations began. Claire drew protective wards over their boots to minimize magical imprint. Theo added redundancy charms, fail-safes in case something pulled them off track. Nora braided a strand of enchanted thread into each of their sleeves so they wouldn't lose one another during the jump. Dean held their own time turner last, turning it over in his hand. This jump is bigger than anything we've done, he said. Farther back, with more moving parts. If it doesn't work... It will, Claire said, stepping beside him. We've planned for everything. They all stood in a circle now, eyes on the centre of the table. The broken time turner ticked, just once, like it agreed. Tomorrow night, Claire said softly. As the others busied themselves gathering their gear and finalising the visual trail markers, Dean noticed Theo standing off to the side, arms crossed, staring at nothing. His brow was drawn, jaw tight. Dean stepped over. Hey, you all right? Theo blinked and nodded a little too quickly. Yeah, just thinking. Dean gave him a moment, waiting. Theo hesitated, then lowered his voice. I just really want this to work. Dean tilted his head, encouraging. If we get a stable model, I might be able to go back. Not to interfere, just observe. I want to see my brother, before everything, before he dropped out. I don't even need to talk to him. I just want to watch, from the shadows, maybe. Just one day where he was still himself, laughing, free, just for a few minutes. Dean nodded slowly. Then let's make sure we get that chance. 10 minutes later, Theo and Charlie vanished into the shimmer. Tuesday, 16 years earlier. The corridor buzzed with student traffic. Laughter and parchment rustled through the air. A few Hufflepuffs bumped into each other near the water fountain. Everything was right on schedule. Charlie adjusted the strap of his satchel. Theo kept an eye on the far end of the hall.
Then he saw her. Hair in big, bushy curls, wand tucked awkwardly in the side of her bag, eyes locked ahead like she had 3 more things to do in 2 minutes. She was alone, moving quickly, and exactly where the logs predicted. "That's her," Theo said. Charlie nodded. They moved. At the bend, Theo shifted slightly to the right, nudging the flow of traffic just enough to angle her into them. Charlie quickened his pace. The plan was simple. A tangle of limbs, a believable stumble, a satchel swing, a hook, and, just as they reached her, she stepped aside, not startled, not delayed. She shifted out of the way like she already knew they were coming, like this had already happened, and she was making sure it didn't happen this time, like she had seen this exact scenario before and knew how to avoid it. Theo faltered. Charlie crashed shoulder first into a tall boy behind her, who let out a loud "Oi!" Books spilled, parchment scattered. But Hermione didn't stop. She walked on, not even turning her head. They returned to the room of requirement early. Claire blinked when she saw them. "You weren't gone the full time." Theo sank onto the couch, silent. Charlie just said, "She moved." Nora frowned. "What do you mean?" "She moved like she already knew what we were about to do," Theo said slowly. "She didn't just dodge us. She sidestepped, like the fall already happened, like she remembered it." No one spoke for a long moment. Then Dean looked up at the wall clock. "Why's it chiming now?" he asked. "Didn't it just chime?" The clock on the wall read 3 p.m., when just a moment earlier it had clearly read 1:59 p.m. It was early morning in the room of requirement, and the group had already been at it for hours. Nora stood by the makeshift wardrobe, pulling a Slytherin tie snug beneath her collar. Claire was hunched over a map spread across the floor, sketching corridors and circling key intersections with a quick hand. Dean tightened his Ravenclaw robes. "Last checks," he said, then turned to the group. "We stay out of the way, blend in. No interference. We observe, we draw, and we disappear." It was Saturday for them, but they would be dropping into a Tuesday of Hermione's 3rd year. "We get in early," Charlie added, adjusting the time dial, "before she even wakes up. That way, we're already hidden when she starts using it." "Cafe hall first, then potions corridor," Claire confirmed. "And she cuts across the back staircase before charms." They'd studied every schedule scrap they could get. Hermione had no idea anyone was watching, and still she made tracking her a nightmare. Nora had suggested a disguise tactic, daily rotation. They wouldn't follow her all at once. Instead, the girls would trail her solo, rotating in and out across different days and uniforms, posing as younger or older years, depending on where they dropped in. On Monday, Claire took the lead. She spent most of the day buried behind a floating stack of books, enchanted to hover just above her desk in the library. From the far side, a narrow slit in the pages gave her an angled view of Hermione's favourite study table. No time-turner visible. Tuesday was Nora's turn. She sat at the edge of the great hall, nursing pumpkin juice for over an hour, while Hermione ate across the room. At one point, just as Hermione reached for a toast slice, the chain slipped forward ever so slightly. There it was, a thin gold shimmer, like sunlight caught on a whisper of thread. Nora tilted the newspaper in her lap, peering through a tiny hole she'd carefully cut into the parchment of the Daily Prophet. From her angle, she could make out the clasp. It looked newer than theirs, clean, intact, but it was fast. Hermione adjusted her collar, and the glint vanished. Wednesday was Claire again. She loitered near the girls' lavatory corridor, pretending to sort a bag of peppermint leaves into potions sachets, while Hermione crossed the hall. Nothing, not even a bump in her stride. If she was using the time-turner, it was seamless. But they knew she was.
They watched the attendance scrolls update in real time. 1 minute she was in ancient ruins, next she was halfway across the castle in care of magical creatures, and no one blinked. Thursday, Nora again. She'd tucked herself beneath a staircase near the charms corridor, eyes fixed on the stone landing above. Just as the period bell rang, she saw 2 Hermiones, one rushing up, one heading down. Only for a second. Her breath caught, but she didn't move. A ripple passed through the torchlight, distorting one of the Hermione silhouettes like heat rising off stone. Then one of them was gone. The second melted into the crowd without anyone noticing. Nora scribbled furiously. On Friday they regrouped. The sketches were laid out in the room of requirement. Claire had drawn the clasp from memory. Nora had added movement notes, when it was visible, when it disappeared. Dean traced a fingertip down the parchment. She uses it between charms and arithmancy. That's the gap. If we're ever going to see how it activates, we need to be in 2 places at once, Charlie finished, which is exactly the problem we've been having. Nora rubbed her forehead. We've hit our limit, haven't we? We've seen all we can. Not everything, Claire said, sliding her notes across. Look at this. The way it hangs. It's not just the object, it's how she keeps it anchored to her timeline. Theo stared at the diagrams. She's not just wearing it, she's hiding it magically. Every time we caught a glimpse, it was during a lapse, when she let her guard down. That means it's charmed, maybe bound to her robes. Dean nodded slowly. Then our time-turners are missing something more than parts. They're missing anchoring, stabilizers. If we'd kept using them long-term... He didn't finish the sentence. For a brief moment, the firelight flickered oddly. Not like a breeze, more like a skipped frame in time. No one noticed. Claire pulled the notes together. We'll use these. Between the activation timing, the chain length, and the glimmering spell, it's enough to start replicating a fully intact design. And she never saw us, Theo asked. She might have felt something, Nora admitted, but we were careful. We didn't interfere. Charlie rolled up the last parchment. Then we're done. We leave her be. Good, Dean said, backing toward the wall where the time-turner device had been resting, dormant for now. Because if we don't start fixing ours soon, it might not matter how careful we've been. We can't even begin to think of how we might stop the anomalies or undo any temporal interference we caused, unless we have a stable time-turner to use. We got too far ahead of ourselves. It's time to fix what we've broken, Dean said, absent-mindedly playing with a spare gear on a work table. And as though he couldn't hold it in any longer, Charlie giggled and said, It's time to fix time. No pun intended there, eh, Dean? Dean suppressed a laugh and chucked the spare gear at Charlie. Oh, shut it, he said. No one argued. Above them, the clock that hung in the room of requirement ticked forward, then paused, then kept ticking, backward. The first real sign came at breakfast. Dean was mid-bite into a piece of toast when the enchanted ceiling above the great hall flickered, not drifted, not shifted, but flickered, like a broken candle flame stuttering in the wind. The stars blinked out for a moment, replaced by a grey static haze, then returned. Most students didn't even notice. A few Ravenclaws paused. A second year pointed upward and murmured something, but conversation rolled on like nothing had happened. Claire looked up from across the table and caught Dean's eye. You saw that too? She asked quietly. Dean nodded. Definitely. Further down the table, someone shrieked. A tray had levitated 6 inches off the table before dropping again, slamming into a plate of sausages and showering nearby students in grease. Just Peeves, someone muttered, wiping their robe sleeve. But Peeves hadn't been in the hall that morning. The staff table, usually indifferent to such disruptions, looked tense. Professor Flitwick whispered something into McGonagall's ear. She frowned and nodded. It was happening. Everywhere. Later that afternoon, the common rooms felt strangely tight. In Gryffindor Tower, Theo sat on the worn velvet couch with a book on his lap, but hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. The fireplace behind him popped, and for a few seconds the flames danced in reverse, reforming the logs before resuming their normal burn. A first-year screamed and ran upstairs. Theo didn't move. The corridors weren't much better. A stairwell that was meant to rotate paused mid-turn and began to spin the other way. Suits of armour glitched in their bowing patterns. A few students, walking together, suddenly found themselves scattered across different floors without explanation. Some thought it was a prank. The society knew better. Back in the room of requirement, the group reconvened. The usual buzz before a meeting. Quiet jokes, shuffling of parchment, notes passed between friends, had vanished. Now the only sound was the low mechanical whir of the broken time-turner in the centre, clicking unevenly, like a dying heart. Claire stood against the wall, watching a floating candle drift overhead. It jerked to the left without warning, before snapping back like a snapped wand. Nora gripped her wand too tightly. Theo didn't speak. Even Charlie was quiet. Dean stared at the table. The half-assembled time-turner was laid out carefully, spare parts surrounding it. After Dean had tried replacing a gear, the time-turner got stuck in a loop of jittery motion. Dean held it tightly and adjusted the gear until the jittering stopped. But something in that moment snapped inside him. "We need to stop," he said. Charlie looked up. "What?" Dean's voice came heavier this time. "We need to stop. Something's wrong. You've all seen it. The school isn't just acting weird, it's breaking. We're pushing too hard. We don't even know if what we're trying to do will work." No one spoke. The air itself felt heavier. Dean couldn't bear making eye contact with any of them, so he kept his eyes either trained on the high ceilings or the crack that had appeared in the floor of the room of requirement. Dean continued, "I'm not saying we didn't learn anything from watching Hermione. We did. But what if we've already gone too far? I think we need to tell someone." "You mean a professor?" Nora said sharply. "Yes." Theo's face dropped. Claire stepped forward, but Charlie got there first. "Dean," Charlie said, voice calm but loaded, "you can leave. No one's forcing you to stay, but don't ask the rest of us to throw away everything we've done. We've sacrificed so much. Our sleep, having to work twice as hard to maintain our grades, our sanity. For this. You got us into this, yeah, but we chose to stay, and we'll keep going, with or without you." Dean looked away. He didn't want to leave. He just didn't want to be the reason everything got worse. "I'm not going anywhere," he said finally. "But if this keeps getting worse, I will have to say something. We can't sit by and let someone get hurt because we got too arrogant." Charlie gave a small nod. "Fair." No one else moved. They returned their focus to the table. Hermione's time-turner had shown them everything they needed. The miniature hourglass, the etched outer ring, the stabilizing gear pin above the clasp. They'd watched her just closely enough to sketch every detail. And now, for better or worse, that was the plan. Rebuild the one she had. Make it work. Fix everything. There was no real logic behind it, no spell that would undo the ripples or rewind the damage. But in their minds, a working time-turner was the key to going back, to making it right. They figured that if they could properly move through time, they might be able to undo some of the weird things that had been happening in the school. Meanwhile, the staff was unravelling their own mystery. Professor Sinistra stood at the front, parchment in hand. She cleared her throat. "We've documented 23 separate magical inconsistencies since the start of the term," she said. "Most are isolated, but a few are repeating. Enchanted objects malfunctioning, staircases freezing mid-shift, corridor loops, time-lagged echoes in some classrooms." Professor Flitwick leaned forward. "Echoes?" Sinistra nodded. "Students repeating phrases before they say them. Objects briefly appearing where they were yesterday instead of where they are now. Most last a few seconds. Then everything snaps back."
"Entire hallways rearranging themselves overnight," Filch grunted. "I caught 4 students stuck in a staircase loop for over an hour. Just kept walking and ending up in the same corridor."
Professor Sprout added, "We lost half a greenhouse rack yesterday. The plants vanished, then reappeared outside the door. Not dead, just relocated, with dirt still stuck to the floor." McGonagall took a steady breath, then glanced at the list Sinistra had placed on the table. "I've been here long enough to know Hogwarts acts up from time to time," she said. "Especially near equinoxes, magical spikes, or when Peeves gets bored. But this is different." She tapped the parchment. The ink jittered faintly, as though resisting her touch. "We don't panic," she said firmly, "but we take it seriously." Heads nodded around the table. "I want staff to start logging incidents immediately. Create a shared archive. Note when, where, and how long each disturbance lasts. We'll hold short update meetings every 3 days." "Should we notify the Ministry?" Professor Vector asked. "Not yet," McGonagall replied. "But if the patterns continue or grow worse, we'll request assistance from Magical Maintenance and the Department of Magical Infrastructure." She looked around the room again. "I don't want this interfering with student safety. For now, we stay calm, stay observant, and start tracking everything." There were no arguments. The meeting ended with quiet agreement. The parchment was left in the centre of the table, its corner still twitching ever so slightly. In the Ravenclaw common room that night, the fire sparked blue, then gold, then vanished entirely, leaving behind crackles with no flame. The younger students huddled closer to the centre. Claire sat with her knees pulled to her chest, sketchbook open across her lap. She'd redrawn the time-turner clasp 3 times. The moment Hermione had leaned forward to grab Pi, her time-turner had slipped just far enough into view. It had taken a week of watching to get that angle. Charlie had noticed how the gear twitched sideways after class. Theo had reconstructed the back ring with absurd detail. They had the sketches. They had the glimpses. Now their attention turned inward, toward rebuilding what they'd broken. It wasn't a real plan, but it was all they had. 2 days later, it rained sideways over the Quidditch pitch. Not diagonally, sideways. Sheets of water hung in mid-air like a wall, running from left to right across the field, with no clouds above and no wind to explain it. By the time Madam Hooch arrived, the rain had stopped, but the players' brooms were soaked on one side and bone dry on the other. No one had an explanation. Then came the sunlight. At exactly 12 minutes past noon on Thursday, the enchanted ceiling in the great hall dimmed. A bright orange twilight fell across the hall. Full sunset, horizon and all, despite the sun still shining high outside. Students looked up in confusion as long shadows stretched across their plates. It lasted for 20 minutes. Then, just as suddenly, the ceiling brightened again, and the sun rose from behind the wrong tower. That night, the astronomy tower reported stars blinking in and out like faulty lanterns. In the charms corridor, 2 clocks ran in opposite directions. A 5th year swore he turned a corner and saw himself leaving the same hallway. Another girl said she was in class, blinked, and then her ink bottle had refilled itself. The castle was shifting. Worse, time was slipping. In the room of requirement, the society was finally back on stable ground. At least, that's what they told themselves. Charlie adjusted the final gear on their prototype, a carefully stabilized version of the old time-turner, now protected by etched runes and a new containment charm. Dean double-checked the alignment. Claire, now the most cautious of the group, tapped the edge with her wand and watched the glow steady into a quiet hum. "This is it," Charlie said. "We've looped it 5 times and not one glitch." "No drift," Theo confirmed. "No delay." No overlapping echoes. The anchor held. Dean swallowed hard. "So we try it." They all looked at each other. Nora gave a nod, and Dean reached for the chain. "I'll go," he said. "Short jump. 5 minutes." Claire hesitated. "Dean." He gave her a soft smile. "We're past the point of no return. If this is going to break something, I'd rather it break on me." The chain slid around his neck. Dean turned the hourglass. 1 rotation. He vanished. He was gone for 5 minutes, exactly 5. When he returned, he was pale but breathing. "It worked," he said, blinking. "It was smooth. No pressure, no disorientation, just 5 minutes back." Nora exhaled. "We've stabilized it." Charlie didn't cheer. He just stared at the glowing timepiece. Dean sat down. "We need to plan the real jump." Everyone went quiet. Hogsmeade shimmered with early spring light, the kind that filtered softly through fresh green leaves and made the windows of honeydukes and scriven shafts sparkle like they were dusted with sugar. Students were already gathering at the gates when Charlie found Nora waiting just off to the side, bundled in her cloak, the corner of her scarf tucked beneath her chin. He nudged her playfully. "You sure you're not just using me to get free sweets?" "I would never," she said, mock-offended. "You're thinking of Claire." Charlie laughed. "You ready?" She nodded, and they stepped through the gates together, boots crunching on the gravel path as the castle receded behind them. Their first stop was, of course, the 3 broomsticks. They slipped into a booth near the back, where the afternoon sun lit half the table, and the air smelled like butterbeer and roasted chestnuts. Nora stirred her drink slowly, watching the foam swirl. "You know, this is the first time I've done a Hogsmeade trip without 5 other Ravenclaws dragging me to the bookshop." "I was going to take you there," Charlie teased. "Was that not romantic?" She smiled. "I'll allow it, but only if you don't rush me through the maps section." He raised his butterbeer in a toast. "To extremely boring date activities." "And to people who secretly love them," she replied, clinking her mug to his. They wandered after that, into Zonko's, where Charlie bought a fanged flyer that nearly took off his thumb, into Honeyduke's, where Nora picked the jelly slugs that stuck to your tongue and made it change colours. They sat by the edge of the Shrieking Shack Hill afterward, trading bites of sugar and stories about their worst classes. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a dusty blue, and the streets began to glow with lamplight. They circled back through the village, their fingers brushing once, then again, then slowly threading together without a word. As they passed a storefront window, Charlie caught the reflection of their hands and smiled to himself. Just before the castle came into view, Nora tugged him gently back toward a side path and kissed him. It was soft, not dramatic, but perfect. She pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes and said simply, "Hi." Charlie grinned. "Hey." Evening settled across the great hall like a velvet curtain, and by the time the Hogsmeade crowd returned, torches were flickering and dinner was underway. At the Ravenclaw table, whispers travelled fast. "Are they holding hands?" Fletcher said, with his mouth half full of sugar quills. "They're beaming," Claire whispered, "like actually glowing." "Should we say something?" asked a Gryffindor girl named Talia. Nora beat them to it. As she and Charlie passed the table, she lifted their joined hands and said, "In case you're wondering, yes. It's official." Charlie gave a small bow. "We accept applause, chocolate, and any gossip that makes us seem more interesting." Dean, meanwhile, leaned over to Claire. "Think it's time?" She nodded. An hour later, after dinner, they gathered in the room of requirement. Theo was still in uniform, his tie a little crooked, lounging in one of the beanbags they'd conjured up weeks ago. "You lot look suspicious," he said as Dean, Claire, and Charlie entered. "You find another cursed rat skeleton or something?" "No," Dean said. "Something better." Charlie stepped forward, nervous in a way he rarely was. "We've been talking, and we want to give you something."
Theo stood up, eyeing the group suspiciously. Okay," he said slowly.
Claire took over, her voice gentler than usual. "You told us about your brother, what it was like when he left, how your parents won't talk about it, how it still hurts." Theo frowned. "Why are we bringing this up?" "Because," Dean said, reaching into his cloak and revealing the newly stabilized time-turner, "we found a moment. One we can safely visit, 10 years ago, just a normal day. No contact," Claire added quickly. "No interference. You'll stay hidden the whole time." "But you'll see him," Charlie said. "The real him, smiling, laughing, before everything changed." Theo's breath hitched. "You're serious?" Dean nodded. "We want to take you. Just us. Just for you." Theo looked between them, eyes wide, lip trembling just slightly. "When?" Dean smiled. "Right now, if you're ready." Theo stood, slower than usual, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's go." Theo looked around at the others, Claire and Nora both nodding. Charlie stood beside Dean, arms crossed but soft-eyed. "You don't have to say anything, mate," Claire said gently. "He won't see you. But you'll see him. The version of him you've been holding on to." They prepared quickly but carefully. Claire handed Theo a packet of enchanted parchment, synchronized to glow when it was time to return. Dean double-checked the coordinates. Charlie offered his usual reassurance in the form of sarcasm, but when he tightened Theo's cloak and clapped a hand on his shoulder, there was no humor in his eyes. "No research. No questions, just us," he said. Theo didn't answer. He didn't have words, but everyone could see a light in his eyes that no one had seen before. The time-turner gave a slight pulsing glow as it was placed around Theo's neck, hands lightly touching the chain or fixing the clasp to make sure it fit properly. Dean spoke the incantation, and golden light swirled around them. When it cleared, they were standing in a familiar place, but not quite. The black lake was still, some glinting off its surface. Trees around the edge were a little smaller, the castle behind them gleaming just a touch younger. Birds chirped. Laughter floated down from the courtyard. And then, "There," Charlie whispered. Across the grass, beneath the shade of a tree, sat a small group of fifth-years, laughing, passing around a picnic blanket and the sketch pad. One of them leaned back on his elbows, face turned up to the sun. Theo stepped forward. His brother. Messy brown hair, school robes half unbuttoned, a pencil tucked behind one ear. He was laughing, really laughing, and sketching a lazy outline of the lake.
"He used to do that," Theo murmured. "Sketch everything. Our cat, my shoes, Mum's glasses, books and books, filled with sketches," Theo reminisced. "I managed to keep one after he left. I tried to add my own sketches to it over the years, but I'm not that great." Theo trailed off. After several seconds in silence, Theo sniffed and wiped away a tear with the back of his sleeve. Neither Dean nor Charlie said anything. They simply put their hands on Theo's shoulders to remind him that they were there with him. The bewitched parchment Claire had given them started to glow, the signal for "it's time to leave." Dean leaned in and whispered, "Time for us to get out of here." With one turn of the hourglass, the boys were right back in their time in the room of requirement, completely unaware of the chaos on the other side of the door.
As the boys stepped into the corridor to meet up with Nora and Claire in the library, they heard shouting. Water was pooled on the ceiling above them, dripping slowly upward. "What the?" Charlie blinked. They rounded the corner and saw it. Sunlight pouring through the windows on the right, while the hallway to the left was soaked in rain. "It's noon," Dean muttered. "Why does it look like sunset?" "Because it is," Claire's voice called from behind them. She was running toward them, breathless, a bundle of crumpled parchment in her hands. "For 20 minutes it's been setting. Then the sun rose again." They turned as the shadows shifted unnaturally across the floor. "I think I found it," Claire shouted, waving the parchment. "The last piece." The entire group turned back and headed up to the 7th floor, back to the room of requirement. Claire unrolled the fragile page. "A misaligned rune," she said breathlessly. "Stabilization protocol. It was off by 3 degrees, enough to throw everything out of sync, especially over long distances." Nora immediately began adjusting the time turner. Dean held his breath. Charlie counted out the seconds as they completed the loop. Claire muttered the binding incantation. The final rune clicked into place. And then, the time turner lit up. Not flickering, not pulsing, a steady, brilliant gold. They all stared. "Wait," Charlie said. "Does this mean we won?" No one answered, but the look on their faces said it all. They had done it. The room of requirement had gone quiet again. After their private celebration, Wizard Rock echoing from a floating radio, fizzing pumpkin juice, chocolate frogs hopping between cushions, the society had finally begun to relax. For the first time in weeks, they allowed themselves to believe it might be over. But the castle said otherwise. The glitches hadn't stopped. They'd slowed, thinned out, grown more scattered, but they hadn't disappeared. Rain still hissed upward on the West Tower stairs. Daylight flickered like candlelight in corridors that should have been stable. A flock of origami ravens flew backwards through the library shelves that morning and vanished mid-air. "Residual," Claire had said, "like the echoes of a spell after the wand's gone still." It was Theo who found the document. They weren't even looking for it. He'd gone to the restricted section to triple-check an unrelated incantation and noticed a crumbling red file wedged behind a shelf panel, sealed in wax with the ministry's old unspeakable sigil. Inside was a single chart. It was weathered, hand-drawn, and completely illegible until Claire laid a revealing charm over it. The ink lifted like stardust from the page and settled into clean, glittering lines. "I think it's a rift chart," she whispered,
voice dry with awe. Dean leaned in. Rift? Timeline convergence points. Places where magical trauma left fractures in time, like scars in a memory. Her brow furrowed. But this doesn't just show where, it calculates when. Nora tilted her head. You mean it chooses for us? Charlie looked uneasy. That's comforting. Claire's eyes flicked across the page, following the sequence of runes and celestial markings. At the base, there was a narrow rectangle pulsing with soft gold. She tapped her wand to it. The date and time appeared, and her face went pale. No. What? Dean asked, stepping forward. Claire swallowed. It's the night before the Battle of Hogwarts. A silence fell over the room. Theo spoke first, voice low. That's where the convergence is? Claire nodded slowly. Under the astronomy tower. It says there's a keystone junction point. Magical, structural. It absorbed too much shock during the battle and never fully recovered. That's where everything started unraveling. And we're supposed to fix it, Charlie said, voice dry. Nora crossed her arms. By going there? With the battle about to break loose above our heads. It's the last piece, Claire said, quieter now. The chart wouldn't have chosen it otherwise. Dean looked down at the time-turner in his hand. The glow had returned, stronger than ever, stable. All of us go, he said, together. Claire nodded. I'll wear it, Dean added. We keep close. No splitting up. No delays. We get in, we cast the stabilizer, we get out. Theo sat down on the edge of a nearby chair, staring at the chart. What exactly do we have to do? Claire unrolled the final note attached to the document. The convergence point is beneath the astronomy tower, not far from where the old foundation lines meet. There's a magical keystone, like a pressure valve for the temporal web. If we get there and cast the stabilizing charm before it fractures under the pressure of battle. It holds, Dean finished. Charlie gave a low whistle. And if we're late? Claire looked up. We'll be standing inside a collapse. No one moved for a long time. Then Nora, with a shaky breath, said, Well, at least we're all insane together. The room had reshaped itself again. No longer warm and celebratory, but focused. Arched stone walls, lanterns hung from low beams. Maps, chalkboards and spellbooks hovered mid-air, open to precise pages. They were quiet as they prepared. Charlie double-checked his wand, then Theo's, then his own again. Nora tied her hair back, then untied it, then retied it again. Claire wrote stabilizer runes on her forearm with enchanted ink so she could trace them in the air without dropping her wand. And Dean fastened the time-turner around his neck, the chain now gleaming like fresh gold, humming gently against his chest. You all ready? He asked. No one answered, but no one turned away. Claire held out the synchronization parchment. It shimmered once. The chart dimmed. The room darkened around them. Here we go. Dean turned the hourglass. The first thing Dean noticed was the air. It was colder. Still. Too still for spring. He staggered slightly as the time-turner stopped spinning, its glow fading against his chest. The others righted themselves around him, breathless but upright. Nora adjusting her footing, Charlie checking Theo's grip on his wand, Claire already scanning their surroundings. They were in the corridor beneath the astronomy tower, not the part students used. This was deeper, off the map, part of the old foundation, Where the stonework was older, the arches more warped. The walls curved inward slightly. Claire held the rift chart in front of her. The lines had gone completely still. The glowing rectangle that once shimmered gold had dulled to slate grey. "We're here," she whispered. Dean glanced at the crumbling archway ahead. The floor sloped downward, uneven with time. Old torch brackets lined the walls, but none were lit. They moved in silence. Every step deeper into the corridor made the magic hum louder. Not loud like a sound, but in that deep gut-twisting way. A pressure behind the ears, like a storm was gathering under their feet. They reached the convergence point a minute later. The rift looked dormant. A jagged seam in the wall, barely visible unless you were trained to look, but the magic around it pulsed like a heartbeat. Claire held up her wand and began to trace the stabilizer rune in the air, the one she'd inked on her arm hours earlier. Dean stepped into place beside her, ready to lend power when she gave the signal. Charlie and Nora flanked the perimeter, wands out, eyes scanning the shadows. Theo stood closest to the door, fingers trembling just slightly on his wand. Claire began the chant. The air thickened instantly. The rune glowed, first pale blue, then white-hot gold. Magic crackled through the stone around them. Dust lifted from the floor in swirling patterns. Then came the first boom from above. Not loud, not yet, but unmistakable. Dean's heart dropped. "That's not thunder," Charlie said sharply. "That's—" "Shield impact," Claire snapped, continuing her chant. "They've started evacuating the students." The battle's already begun. Another sound, distant, but closer now, like stone moulding against stone. Theo flinched. "We have to hurry." The seam in the wall glowed brighter, a fine fracture of white light beginning to bleed outward from the convergence point. It looked like the stone itself was about to split in two. "Now, Dean," Claire said, voice shaking with effort. Dean raised his wand. Together they shouted the binding incantation. A wave of gold magic surged outward, radiant, forceful, precise. The room trembled. The seam shuddered, then slowly, gradually, began to seal. The light dimmed, the pressure in the air faded, and then, just like that, silence. Not from above. Above was roaring now. Screams, explosions, the chaos of war. But down here, the rift had calmed. It was stable. "It's done," Claire breathed. Nora turned toward Dean. "We have to go." But Theo wasn't moving. He was staring down the corridor, back the way they'd come. Dean followed his gaze and froze. A figure was standing at the end of the hallway, tall, in dark student robes. 5th year. Theo's breath caught. "No," Claire's voice cracked. "Theo, don't." But it was too late. Theo took one step forward, and his brother turned, hearing something. Not seeing them, just sensing something strange in the air. His eyes passed right over the society, no contact, no recognition. But Theo stood frozen, eyes wide, heart pounding, just watching him. His brother shifted his bag on his shoulder, then walked off toward the courtyard stairwell, unaware that his little brother stood feet away through the curtain of time. Claire reached out and gently tugged Theo back. "We have to go," she said softly. The glow around the time-turner was beginning to pulse again, urgently now. Dean tightened his grip on the time-turner. The others held on. The spell activated, and the society disappeared from the corridor, 5 students vanishing into time. They all felt it,
that strange tug behind the navel, the air folding around them, the way light seemed to collapse in on itself. But when they landed, it was wrong. Dean stumbled forward into a patch of wet grass, blinking hard. Trees loomed around them, branches swayed above. "This isn't the astronomy tower," Claire said quietly. Dean turned a slow circle. "No, this is the edge of the forbidden forest." "We overshot," Charlie guessed. "There is no overshooting a time turner between locations. We are travelling time, not apparating," Nora said, with slight annoyance and panic in her voice. Theo looked up at the sky, pale with the last traces of day. "We're not even close." Dean raised the time-turner again. "Hold on." He reset it with a twist, and they jumped. This time they landed in the kitchens, surrounded by startled house elves. A platter of treacle tart crashed to the floor. One of the elves let out a shriek and vanished with a pop. Claire grabbed Dean's arm. "Something's wrong." Dean slowly opened his hand and looked at the time-turner. The hourglass was cracked straight through. One of the inner brass gears dangled loose, wobbling slightly with every motion. "It's broken," he whispered. Nora's face paled. "We need to repair the time-turner." The five of them moved fast, dodging out the swinging door into the corridor. Theo glanced back. "We have to fix it." On the third floor, a group of older students in Gryffindor robes came around the corner. Charlie grabbed Nora's hand and yanked her back behind a statue. "Go!" They darted across the hall, slipping into the next staircase. Dean kept glancing at the cracked glass in his palm. "We need to repair the time-turner." By the time they reached the stretch of wall where the room of requirement appeared, Dean was sweating. He passed 3 times. "We need a place to repair a time-turner. We need a place to repair a time-turner. We need a place to repair a time-turner." The door formed. They stepped inside. But it wasn't right. The room that greeted them wasn't the safe, familiar sanctuary they knew. It was dim and strange. Dust floated in the air. The walls were stacked with crates and odds and ends, as if left over from someone else's request. Someone from this timeline. Claire stepped forward slowly. "It doesn't recognize us." "This isn't our version of Hogwarts," Theo muttered. "We don't exist here." Dean closed the door behind them. "We need to find something to help." Now they split up, moving between shelves and crates, opening drawers, shifting magical objects they didn't recognize. Nora found an old wand repair kit. Charlie uncovered a small toolkit with rune alignment tools and a fragile bottle of enchanted glass mender. Claire dusted off an old book titled Temporal Frameworks, Field Repairs and Emergency Seals. They sat in a circle on the floor. Dean carefully set the cracked time-turner in the middle. "I can try to reconnect the gear," Claire said, flipping through the repair book. Theo adjusted his glasses. "But if the enchantment is fractured through the hourglass—" "Then this is just a patch," Claire finished. "We'll have one more jump, maybe." Dean looked around at all of them. "Then we make it count." Charlie crouched beside him, helping hold the ring steady as Claire applied the mending spell. The cracked glass glowed faintly. The gear clicked once and held. No one breathed for a moment. Then Dean exhaled. "All right, let's get out of here." Claire nodded. "Before something else goes wrong." They rose in unison, unaware that the corridor outside had just started flickering with unstable magic, and that one hallway down, the portraits had all stopped moving. The timeline was beginning to tear. The castle was groaning, not metaphorically, literally. As the society sprinted down the final staircase, the walls shimmered like heat waves. One corridor flickered, stone bricks momentarily replaced by open sky before snapping back into place. The air felt wrong, stretched too thin. Time itself was fraying. Down one hallway, the portraits had all gone blank, not frozen, just gone. Every frame hung empty, as if the people inside had already fled. Every time they'd used the damaged time-turner around the castle, it had carved tiny magical fractures into the world, hairline cracks in reality. Now those fractures were splitting open. The timeline was starting to tear. Somehow, the upper floors were still intact, for now. They made it to the restricted section of the library just as a fresh tremor rocked the castle. Shelves rattled, a lamp shattered. Shadows spilled everywhere, broken only by the faint blue glow from the enchanted windows. "Start looking," Dean ordered. "Anything on time ruptures, temporal bindings, stabilizing spells, anything that might help." They fanned out, grabbing scrolls and books and dusty folders. Claire found a volume on latticework charms. Theo discovered a sheaf of handwritten notes labelled Department of Mysteries, Experimental Drafts. Nora tossed down a cracked leather journal from the top shelf. No one spoke unless they had something. Pages flipped, wands lit. Dust floated like snow in the still air. "This might be it," Theo muttered, handing Claire a parchment. "Behaviour threads for multi-directional loops. We might be able to adapt it." Dean and Charlie were huddled over a thick tome titled Temporal Constructs and Countermeasures. Diagrams sprawled across the pages, anchoring runes, containment circles, something that looked disturbingly like a wand buried in stone. Then Charlie froze. He jabbed a finger at a section on temporary spatial anchoring, a way to stabilize a rift long enough for a reset, not a fix, just enough to hold the timeline steady until the magic could rebuild itself. Dean's eyes scanned the page. "Could we copy this?" Charlie nodded once, then ripped the page out. He scribbled a set of notes in the margin and slid the page to Dean. "Let's try one last jump," Charlie said, "from the room of requirement. If it works, we land clean in our original time. If not, we're out of options anyway." Nobody argued. The castle groaned again as they ran. Plaster rained down behind them. The air shimmered. Portraits blinked in and out of frames. Staircases twisted in the wrong direction. One hallway they'd just exited collapsed behind them with a groan like thunder. But the room of requirement still answered. The door appeared. They threw it open. Inside, the space shaped itself instantly into their familiar magical lab. The glowing hourglass was already waiting, its edges flickering, a slow leak of golden sand trailing down the table. They gathered around. Dean adjusted the time-turner carefully. The sand turned, and just like that, they were gone. The landing was rougher than usual. Dean hit the stone hard, knees buckling, but the moment he stood, he knew. They'd made it. The world felt whole again. No shimmer in the air, no flickering walls. They were back. He turned to the others, but Charlie was already backing away. Dean blinked. "Charlie?"
Charlie was gripping the time-turner again. He was turning it. "What are you doing?" Dean lunged forward, but the hourglass was already spinning. Dean reached him just in time. He grabbed Charlie's arm as the world ripped apart again, light fractured, and they vanished. They landed hard in the middle of a crumbling corridor. The hallway twisted, bleeding light through cracks in the floor. Everything rippled. The walls pulsed like a heartbeat. Whole sections of the castle blinked out and reappeared like faulty candlelight. "What the hell are you doing?" Dean shouted. "You brought us back here? Are you insane?" "You weren't supposed to come," Charlie yelled. "Why did you have to go and grab me?" "Why the hell wouldn't I grab you? You're my best mate. And what are you playing at, travelling back here? And what is happening? I thought we had patched things up."
Dean's thoughts flowed from his mouth, like the sand flowing from the time-turner. He couldn't gather himself long enough to think straight. "I read the rest of the anchoring spell," Charlie snapped. "It won't hold unless someone physically stays inside the rift." "It has to be reinforced with magic, on sight, from within, or it collapses all over again," Charlie yelled, over the roar of massive stones tumbling into piles, then reorganizing themselves back into corridors. "Dean, we never fixed anything. We were never going to fix anything by just getting back to our time. I just needed to get all of you out here." Dean shook his head violently. "No, we'll find another way. We'll come back with a plan. We'll stabilize it together." "There isn't time," Charlie shouted. "You saw what happened. The fractures are already consuming parts of the castle. This timeline can't hold much longer." "You're not doing this alone," Dean snapped. "We swore we wouldn't." Charlie stepped forward, face inches from Dean's. "You always do this," he said quietly. "You always try to fix it yourself. But this time, I'm not giving you the chance," he said with tears welling up in his eyes. "Like I said before, I chose to stay. I knew how dangerous it could be. Now go, but make sure they use my best side in the history books." Even in a situation like this, Charlie managed to crack a joke. Tears were streaming down Dean's face as he fought against a laugh. Charlie always knew what to say in the wrong moments. "Stop messing around, Charlie. We've got to get out of here." Charlie shoved the time-turner into Dean's chest and pushed him away. Dean barely caught it as he stumbled backwards. "Charlie, go!" Charlie yelled at Dean, pointing to a path he could take to escape. Charlie turned and sprinted. Dean screamed after him, but Charlie was already at the far end of the corridor, where a glowing rupture had cracked open in the air like a gash in fabric. Time poured through it, light, memory, sound, all unravelling. Charlie didn't hesitate. He lifted his wand and stepped into the fold. A twist of motion, one final pattern cut through the air. The rupture collapsed inward, and he was gone. Dean ran to the spot, but it was already fading, threads of golden light snapping closed like stitches pulled tight. There was nothing left, just the cracked stones beneath his feet and the faint hum of residual magic. Then the corridor started to collapse. Bricks burst apart. Bookshelves vanished mid-air. The ground beneath Dean's boots began to ripple. The sand in the time-turner was spilling fast, a steady leak from a fractured glass chamber. Dean turned and ran. Behind him, everything fell. Whole chunks of corridor vanished into nothing. Paintings blinked out. The seams of the world were splitting open, the entire timeline trying to erase itself before his eyes. He sprinted harder. There, up ahead, a door, the room of requirement. Still holding, still real. Dean crashed through it just as the last grains of sand slipped through the hourglass. The world snapped. He hit the floor hard, panting. It was quiet. The room had returned to its simplest form, a square space with nothing but a basin, a mirror, and a folded set of clothes on a bench. No glow, no lab, no Charlie. Dean sat there a long time. Then, without a word, he stood. He washed his hands, changed into the fresh clothes, looked once in the mirror, and walked toward the door. He didn't know where the others were. He didn't know how this would end. But he was going to find the society, and he was going to bring Charlie home. Dean stood alone in the room of requirement, the only sound the faint ticking of the broken time-turner in his hand. He was bruised, scraped, and exhausted, but he was alive. The room, as if sensing what he needed, had given him a small wash basin, clean clothes, and a mirror. He changed into the uniform it provided, a Ravenclaw jumper, pressed slacks, and fresh socks. He folded his damaged clothing carefully and tucked it into his satchel, along with the time-turner. There wasn't much time. If he was going to save Charlie, he needed help.
First he had to find the rest of the society. He left the room and made his way out into the corridors. The castle was calm, too calm after what he'd just come from. The hallways were whole, unbroken. No flickering arches, no shifting floors. The portraits were moving again, chatting softly among themselves. The storm was over. But the cost of it hadn't yet made sense. He eventually spotted Nora and Claire seated on a grassy hill outside, books spread across their laps, laughing quietly in the sunlight. Dean couldn't understand it. They sat there so leisurely, like the Time-Turner Society wasn't in the middle of a disaster. Dean approached carefully, trying to keep his voice steady. "Claire, Nora, I need your help, now. It's Charlie." He jumped back to that other timeline and bound himself to a tear in time. "We've got to get him back. There is no time to waste. Let's find Theo and get to the room of requirement." They looked up. Nora gave him a puzzled smile. "Charlie?" Dean blinked. "Yeah, Charlie. I just made it back. He used himself as some kind of manual anchor to keep the timeline from collapsing." Claire looked at him blankly. "Wait, what do you mean, stuck in time? Is this some kind of a joke?" Dean stared between them. You don't remember him?" Nora shook her head slowly. "Dean, who's Charlie?" His chest tightened. "You're serious?" he whispered. "You really don't remember?" They exchanged nervous glances. Dean backed away. No, that's not right." He turned and took off running. If they didn't remember, maybe Theo would. He sprinted across the lawn back into the castle and searched everywhere he thought Theo might be. After several minutes, Dean leaned against a high window. He could just make up Theo on the Quidditch pitch, wrapping up practice. Dean took off and caught up with Theo coming out of the changing room, broom still in hand. Dean waved him down. "Theo! Please, I need to talk to you. Do you remember Charlie?" Theo tilted his head. "Charlie?" Dean's voice caught. "From the society. Charlie, my dorm mate, my best friend." Theo frowned, adjusting the broom on his shoulder. "I mean, there's a second year in my house named Charlie, but he's not a part of any society that I know of. Don't know him beyond that. Why?" Dean felt the air go out of his lungs. Theo squinted. "You okay?" Dean stepped back. "You really don't know him?" "Mate, I'd remember if I could. Are you sure you're okay? I can walk with you to the hospital wing if you aren't feeling well." Dean didn't say anything. He just turned and walked away. One more place. He made his way back to the Ravenclaw Tower, up the winding stairs and through the common room. He hurried toward the boys' dormitory and stopped in the doorway. Charlie's bed. It was empty, untouched. No trunk, no textbooks, no sweets stashed in the drawer, no books piled on the nightstand. No Charlie. Dean crossed the room slowly and sat down on his own bed. He stared at the place where Charlie's bed used to be alive with life. He swallowed hard and looked down at his lap. He didn't understand why he was the only one who remembered. After a while he opened his satchel. He needed to bring his ruined clothes to the laundry room so the house elves could repair them. He reached in and pulled out the folded pants. That's when he felt it. A piece of paper tucked into the pocket. He froze. He unfolded the page carefully. It was the one Charlie had ripped from the book back in the library. Notes scribbled in every margin, arrows looping between half-broken diagrams, bits of ink smudged like he'd written it in a rush. Dean scanned the top. It was filled with anchor theory, messy, handwritten equations and runes, and beneath them,
a short passage in Charlie's handwriting that caught him off guard. "If you're reading this, Dean, then you came back, and I didn't." Dean's breath caught. He read the sentence again, slower. "I'm sorry. I couldn't tell you what I was planning." Dean shook his head. "No. Charlie, what did you do?" His eyes dropped to the next line. "It was the only way to make sure the timeline didn't collapse." Dean felt his chest tighten. He remembered Charlie reaching for the edge of the temporal rupture, refusing to let go. The blinding light. The roar of splitting magic. The door slamming shut behind him. "I had to anchor it myself. No spells, no theories, no devices." Dean whispered. "Just presence." It clicked. He felt it like a blow to the ribs. It needed someone to stay. Dean's hands trembled. "You knew. You knew all along, and you didn't say anything." Dean whispered, anger rising in his voice. Dean's eyes scanned further. "If you still remember me, this book was right." Dean swallowed. "You're witnessing me anchoring the timeline locked a bit of yourself in that time. And carried me back as a memory with you." Dean shut his eyes. "That's why no one else remembers, because I saw it happen." He looked down again, the words blurring as he read, "I'm sorry for that. You always believed in the society." "In me," Dean's voice cracked. "Of course I did. That matters now more than ever. I know you'll keep it going. Make a name for yourself." Dean gritted his teeth and wiped his cheek with the back of his sleeve, tears welling up and burning his eyes. "I believe in you, Dean. I always did." The final words came small, almost cramped at the bottom of the page. "Don't let them forget me. And don't forget who you are. Charlie." Dean sat there, the note resting gently in his hands. And for a long time he said nothing. Dean didn't realize that tears were streaming down his face until a few drops fell onto the note he was holding, smearing a bit of the ink. He folded it back up carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of his jumper. Time passed. Weeks, maybe more. Dean sat on a grassy hill overlooking the black lake, the wind tugging softly at his sleeves. The afternoon sun made the water shimmer. He picked up a flat stone and flicked it into the lake. It skipped once, twice, 3 times, then again 5, 6, 7 more times. He gave a small, quiet cheer. Yes. Reflexively he turned, grinning. "Did you see that?" But no one was there. No Charlie leaning back on his elbows, no sarcastic smirk, no clever comeback. Just the breeze. Dean let the smile fade. He turned back toward the lake. Then he heard it, soft and unmistakable. Charlie's laugh, carried faintly on the wind. Dean closed his eyes. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, listening. And somewhere, beyond the folds of time, a boy named Charlie was still watching.